Okay, we're in business. Good evening and welcome to the September 30th, 2024 meeting of the Needham Finance Committee. As always, we are doing this in a hybrid fashion, so there are maybe some people participating, listening to the meeting remotely. They will not be able to participate in the meeting, but can view the meeting. So I call the meeting to order. First on the agenda are any citizen requests to address the Finance Committee.
I could address it, Gary and Jamie. Town meeting member, precinct.
Sure. Do you want to
You can write it down.
sit down? You can. Feel
I
free.
sit right next to Barry. Will you be okay with that?
Yeah.
Fine. Thank you, Barry. Thank you all for being a part of this very important committee. You guys are all very highly respected and looked up to in town. Thank you for your work, the hard work that you do. Many of you know that back in May, I represented a group of about 35 residents who wanted more financial information about the impact of the proposed rezoning. I think it was called Article 46, I believe. We were told at that time that the information was redundant and unnecessary. But many of them are still seeking that information now. Looking for pretty straightforward, for example, a one-page document for a base proposal, a one-page document for the jumbo or the large proposal, and just a clear, in-depth report on each of those two proposed votes that are coming up very quickly in a few weeks, really. And to give town meeting members the chance to thoroughly read, research, understand what they're voting on, not just the emotional side of the zoning, but the actual factual and as you guys are the experts, the financial impact, short-term, long-term, irregardless of whether this happens quickly or slowly over, 5 years or 39 years, whatever the proposal, the propensity was suggested by the consultant. Indications are that Lexington received their approval from the state in December of 23. And, very quickly, the following year, they received quite a few site plan proposal reviews. Just going to their planning board website indicates, a long list of planning board site plan review projects, which is great. We just want to make sure Needham is prepared for that, and the town meeting members understand that. Many have heard, don't worry, it's not going to happen. It'll happen over, a long period of time. And, they're coming to me as a town meeting member, asking me questions that I can't answer. I kind of took it upon myself to canvass a number of people. And, first off, they tell me they don't even know this is happening. I would say 9 out of 10 people that I approach randomly do not even know that this is being undertaken. When they do understand it, they get concerned. And they ask, of course, it's reasonable, they ask for more information. And the history that I've studied, I'm fairly new to town meeting, but the history that I've investigated through others that know much more than myself indicates that Needham has always insisted that financial impact of large projects such as this are thoroughly vetted before moving forward, especially when they have such a wide-ranging effect. And we don't see that this has been done here. That's why I'm coming to this board. Additionally, Needham always has evaluated indirect costs, such as the impact on schools, class sizes, redistricting, et cetera. And again, this analysis, it's not clear, it's missing. There are a lot of reports, but it's very difficult for people to understand them. You guys understand it a lot better than the average citizen who, really can't wade through hours and hours of meetings, really can't wade through, 14 pages of reports. So again, that one-page document for the base plan, that one-page document for the larger jumbo plan. And the indirect costs as well, not just the direct costs, but things that have a ripple effect, like when you drop a rock in a pond, there are outer rings that get affected. So as it stands, it seems clear that these costs have not been fairly or fully vetted. And Needham has never voted on projects of this scope without complete information. So we need the information prior to the vote. Is there enough time? I don't know. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sherry.
Great. Lee, did you want to come up?
You wanna do minutes?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, wait, sorry about that. Forgot about that.
Minutes for September 18th.
Okay. Did anybody have any?
I reviewed the minutes. I myself didn't have any revisions to them. I didn't.
Anyone else? No. Great, Tina?
I wasn't here, so.
Okay. All right,
So I move the acceptance of the finance committee meetings of September 18th. Second.
all in favor?
Aye.
Great, those minutes are approved. So let's begin, articles 9 to 11, zoning changes regarding MBTA community staff.
There are a bunch of us.
That's okay.
I need to follow up some chairs.
Gina, do you want to scoot over here so they can, you mind? Thank you.
Chairs for a while. Sorry about that.
Not gonna bite.
Unless you make me angry.
I'm not tonight. They said something.
You never know.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
Great.
Hi. So we have a presentation, to walk you through the zoning articles.
Okay, and that was the one that you sent ahead, right? So that
That's
was
the one we
included
sent
in the
ahead,
packet.
right?
Yep.
Right. And there's a group of us that will be doing the presentation, Natasha, Chair of the Planning Board, myself, and Katie King. Great,
And Artie's the vice chair.
and Artie, sorry, is the vice
I
chair.
just want the presentation.
We're gonna save you for solar, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
He's answering all the questions.
Yeah, that's it. I'm the fall guy.
Thank you very much for having us today. As Lee mentioned, I'm Natasha Scott, I'm the planning board. So, just to give a big picture on the MBTA Communities Act overview, the law, MGL C 40A, section 3A, establish a requirement that each of the 177 designated MBTA communities must have zoning that provides at least one district of reasonable size in which multifamily is allowed, as of right. Cannot have age restrictions and shall be suitable for families with children, must have a minimum gross density of 15 dwellings per acre. And a portion of the district must be located a half a mile from an MBTA station. And commuter rail communities, including Needham, have a deadline to comply by December 31st of 2024. So Needham's MBTA communities requirement, so this is specifically for us based on the amount of stations that we have, is gross acres, 50 acres, the unit capacity, 1,784 units. Dwelling units per acre is 15 dwelling units per acre, and the percentage to be located in station area is 90%. The other 10% could be located any place in town. And Lee's gonna go through all of these details, but I'm gonna give you a big picture of all of this. So the next page is the Hone Advisory Group. So we started Hone, and there'll be a timeline, as a group of experts, or advisors to be able to create the best But I think the planning board was the one that so created Hone with the select board to create an advisory group to deal with the compliance of these MBTA Communities Act specific to Needham, not just generic. And so the group advised the select board and the planning board on the proposed zoning for the town meeting that's coming up. So with the appointed by the select board were Heidi Frail, who was my co-chair, and then Kevin Keene, and then Jean McKnight was the other planning board designee. In addition to that, we had Josh Levy and then Karen, you came on board from the finance committee. We had Liz Campagna, who was a renter. We had Michael Diener, who's a community member at large, and he's also on the board of assessors. We had Ron Ruth, who's a real estate, a land use attorney. We had to have an architect, a land use planner, land use attorney, or real estate developer fill these two roles. And Bill Lovett, who was a real estate developer, and I'm an architect, a registered architect in Massachusetts. So we had a really great group, including Alex and Lee Newman and Alex Clee, and then Katie King was also part of it. So we had a pretty large group that worked together for a very long time. Okay, so the next one is, in addition to, and I just want to mention this, in addition to our group, we created a charge, but I also wanted to say that we consulted with town entities and consultants, including Chris Heath, town council, the Department of Public Works, which included engineering, highway division, water, sewer, and drains division, and all of that, Katie and Lee will discuss the findings. We also met several times with Needham Public Schools, the finance department, building department, police department, and fire department. And we had an incredible amount of community input. It started with unprecedented communication to get people out there. We had three community meetings, and Hone worked hard to make sure that there was extensive community input and so I'm super proud because some of the other towns we've heard have passed this pretty quickly, but we took every ounce of time to be able to do this. So the charge ended up being to lead a broad public engagement effort for the Needham community to envision and shape zoning to allow multifamily housing that complies with the MBTA Communities Act. Utilize these recommendations that were given in the town of Needham's 2022 housing plan as a starting point, which Carol, you were part of it. Evaluate build outs, projections, and analysis of fiscal, school enrollment, and infrastructure impacts provided by staff and consultants. Consider related zoning elements that are allowed but not required under the MBTA Communities Act, including but not limited to inclusionary zoning, which are affordable housing requirements and parking minimums. Update the select board, planning board, and finance committee throughout the process on group deliberations and community feedback. And then recommend draft zoning to the select board and planning board to submit to DHCD and town meeting, so DHCD being the state. So the next one, slide. It should be I can just start talking about it while it's moving, but it's basically the schedule that we had. So the housing plan working group and adoption of the housing plan occurred between October 2021 and January 2023. So that's this one right here. The creation and appointment of Hone happened on March 2022 through August 2023. And then Hone launched in September of 2023, so a year ago. And we had 3 community meetings. Community meeting 1 on November of 2023, and that was a listening session with boards. Everybody had Post-its. I think we had a lot of attendance. I think for all of these, we'd have between 100 and 300 people. Community meeting 2, January of 2024, where we came with some recommendations, and then a listening session again. And then community meeting 3, March of 2024, where we showed the zoning, the actual, that was written by one of our consultants. So we have 2 consultants that were hired for this. Eric Halverson from RKG and her name here, Emily Ennis from Ennis and Associates. What RKG did was they worked on all of the planning with us, with Ennis Associates together. But Eric was putting things into models and giving us feedback all the time. Emily was focusing on zoning. She wrote the zoning articles with Lee and with Chris Heath reviewing them. So it was a really great team. And then we had a lot of input from the group. So then the next one is, in order to meet the December 2024 final state review, Cone issued the final report of zoning in April of 2024. The state preview is 90 days, so that happened between May and August. The planning board updated the zoning article, so during that time, the planning board updated the zoning articles, we had several meetings, that's in August of 2024. And we had a planning board public hearing a couple of weeks ago on September 5th, 2024, which also had significant attendance. And then we met on the 17th to discuss the language, and then we needed more information and got more information. And on the September 24th, which was last week, we made the finalized the zoning for warrant with all of the correspondence and community input that we received. So the special town meeting, of course, is October 21st, and then the final state review. When we gave the state preview of zoning, we received minimal comments. So our consultants did a really great job of putting this together to make sure that the comments were mostly, and you guys will probably talk more about it, but it was mostly small changes to make sure that it complied perfectly with it. And so we were really pleased with the outcome of that.
Natasha, I didn't want to interrupt, but I might forget this, so.
Yeah.
But the state only opined on the compliance plan, right? So they didn't look at the two competing plans. There's no reason for them to look at the neighborhood plan. Is that
Lee, can you?
right?
clarify that?
They looked at both plans. Both plans were submitted for comment.
Okay,
So the comments we got back,
And the zoning articles.
and
the
they looked at all the zoning articles. So yes, their comments were based on both.
thanks.
And where do we get their comments? Where can I find what?
Email it to
Send-
Molly.
Yep.
And they're also in all the planning board meetings because, and in all the community meeting. Had some information on that too.
So were the planning board updates in August primarily based on the feedback you got from the state?
And the community. So there were two pieces that we did. One was that the state was just changing words and zoning, like little things here and there. The one thing that we did here, there were a couple of things, and there were some changes that we made, and Artie, if you have any comments on that also. There were a couple of things that Lee put into an email about changes that we made regarding 100 West Street. We heard from the community. It was also, and they're gonna go through it, you know, all the
Okay.
different pieces. But another piece that was really critical that we heard, we got correspondence even after the public hearing. We got it from Bob Smart, we got it from Holly Clark and a couple of others, is on the site plan review. We looked at Wellesley, we looked at what was happening in other towns, including Rockport, who actually just used their bylaws. Ours is more specific, and we put a lot more work into it. And so we felt that we were concerned about as of right site plan review and put a lot of effort into that with comments from other attorneys in town that were reviewing it. Okay, and so the next one, and stop me at any point, or I'm gonna let Lee talk about it, but before that, I just want to give some statistics and not statistics, but kind of a big picture, because this is a lot of information. So I just want to, just in general, one of the people just came up to us all the time and said, is this development, or are you developing? No, zoning is creating these laws for future development, right? To create, to divide land by use, density, and dimensions. So it's not development, but when we create or revise zoning, it means that we're revising the rules and make sure that we agree with them. And one of the reasons I say that is because something to note is that multifamily housing is currently allowed in all districts by right or by special permit in Needham, except for two, which is the industrial district and the business district. So we already have multifamily housing everywhere. We allow single family housing and two family in the industrial and business districts, but currently don't allow multifamily. And most of those districts are near the MBTA stations. So just big picture, because I know it's overwhelming. Okay, parking is currently 1.5 spaces per unit. We currently have 18 dwellings per acre as the max dwellings per acre. That's all in the current zoning, and they're requiring 15. So height as of right is 2.5 to 3 stories and up to 4 stories in Avery Square by special permit. So we already have things that are 2.5 and 3 stories in our zoning. FAR, the floor area ratio, so the proportion of square footage on a site. In most districts, it has a floor area ratio, FAR, of 0.7, but it ranges from 0.35 to 1.1. But we also have a series of overlays that increase the density in certain districts. So in May of 2009, I wasn't part of the planning board, but I know because I keep my book here. Needham enacted zoning to implement the recommendations of the Needham Center Plan for 3 zoning districts, namely Needham Center, Chestnut Street, and Garden Street. The purpose was to kind of create and encourage at an appropriate scale, density, mix of uses, and the design and redevelopment and infill development of existing properties in those 3 areas. So this happened in May 2009. The height and density, and you're gonna see some of these things that I'm gonna share in a second, were increased in Needham Center to a 3-story profile around Town Hall so that we wouldn't overwhelm Town Hall, and 4 stories in the remainder of the district. An FAR of 2.0 was set. As it relates to Chestnut Street corridor, the height was set at 4 stories, again, with a floor area ratio of 2. And as it relates to Garden Street, the height was set as 3 stories with an FAR of 1 and 1.2 for mixed use. And then access to this increased density was by special permit. But the development today, under these 3 overlays that happened, only 1 project has been permitted to date. The property at 50 Dedham Ave, right next to Little Spoon, or right down the street. Where a 3+1 story, so a 4-story mixed-use building was approved, which includes 10 residential units. There was only 1 affordable out of those. 2 first-floor retail units, each less than 800 square feet, and the permit was issued in July of 2012. So the conclusion is that even if you change all of the zoning and we made all these overlays, we've already increased it even higher than we're doing in some. It only created 1 project and I don't know, I just want to make sure that everybody understands that, because we're not creating development, we're creating rules allowing multifamily housing and business and industrial. So with that, I'll let Lee talk about the super technical, but I just.
Now we can all go to sleep.
Yeah.
So Lee, can I just ask you one question just on that chart? If the Needham requirement is 50, just running down the numbers on the far left column, wouldn't the base compliance plan be those same numbers? So in a sense, isn't what we're calling the base compliance plan actually more than what our requirement is?
It's more than what your requirement is, but when you start assigning these rules and you start applying them to parcels, what the calculation comes out to be is a 1,870. And it's really very, it would be very difficult to kind of bring it down. You would be tinkering with it to bring it down effectively. I mean, what's happening is you've decided on what the rules are across these different districts in terms of, and what we did on the base compliance plan was pretty much model the existing zoning in existing zoning districts, introducing the use in the business district and in the industrial district. And when you apply those dimensional standards and you run it through the model, and it does a calculation, which is basically giving you an FAR calculation, dividing it by 1,000 and giving you a generation of number of units. So that's pretty much as close
So
as
in other
we-
words, some towns have just because of the way they're set up or the land they have or whatever, that they might be able to create a district for this. Whereas what we did here is, at least if I understand it, and absolutely correct me if I'm wrong, we basically took our existing zones and said, we're not creating a new zone or making a mega zone. We're gonna kind of across the board, our present zones, increase them in certain ways. Is that a fair way to put it?
I think so, and I think you'll see that when you see the geography of where the district is located along the Highland Avenue corridor, that the uses are being placed along that Highland Avenue corridor, and it's taking advantage of the density you already have in existing apartment districts, which are built out. We're grabbing credit for what is already zoned and built. And then we're essentially allowing the use to occur in the Chestnut Street Business District where it already can occur, converting it from a special permit use to an as of right use, introducing it in business, and introducing it basically in the industrial districts.
Can I add just one point to that also? Because there's multiple requirements that has to be met, if you were trying to hold to the acreage of 50, you'd actually have to build much more dense housing on,
Taller.
you'd have to go higher to limit the footprint of the district. So that was one of the discussions early on in Hone is, are we trying to get at the smallest footprint, but then you have to go taller, or do you want to balance it kind of in the way that Lee described?
And then, John, I think to go to a little bit to your question, there's some comment about Lexington. Lexington has some plan, like there's apparently some large plans coming in, but they have open space, they have space available for them to do that. We don't have that.
Right, and like
space.
Westwood is another.
Yeah,
example.
we don't have that space. We're trying to deal with the jigsaw that we have.
So like the Crescent area industrial, how many acres is that?
The actual, we have it, I don't know if I have the actual acreage of the district.
For example, that in and of itself wouldn't satisfy the 50 acres.
No,
But maybe that in another industrial area could satisfy the 50 acres.
well, potentially, and then you could have had higher density within those 50 acres. I think we felt that we had an existing corridor, the Highland Avenue corridor, where we already had commercial development happening, and we also had a set of rules about building volume within those districts. And so we were just kind of taking advantage of that volume, and in some cases converting the situation from a special permit use to an as of right use. In other situations, taking advantage of the volume you already had there and introducing a new use.
There also has to be some continuity acreage as well.
Right.
Continuity,
Continuity and actually touching.
right, I understand. Thank you.
So essentially, the zoning that you're gonna see in front of you is based upon two plans that Home considered. One is called, I think, the base compliance plan. And as I mentioned earlier, that plan was designed to follow closely the existing zoning boundaries and dimensional standards in Needham, and was designed to actually meet the minimal requirements of the act. And then the second plan, which has two zoning articles around it, was called the neighborhood housing plan, and that plan, basically, it increases the dimensional standards and the number of units that can be built as a way of producing greater housing, basically aligned with what was articulated and recommended in the housing plan. So as this chart says, you know, our requirement, Needham's requirement is 1,784 units. The base compliance plan gets you to 1,870. And the neighborhood plan under the zoning profile gets you to 3,296.
So how about just on that one? Was it considered possibilities of middle ground between 1,870 and 3,296? In other words, was it considered, let's looking at, I'll just use the number, 2,400? And so it seems to me it's a pretty big delta on the unit capacity and on the density. Those two are the two that jump out at me from that. And what consideration was given to between those two? And then why was the decision made to go more dense and go more units?
And I think in general, I was gonna tell you, see how it came down? Because we based, and you'll see it in a second, we're gonna go through each district to show you how we did it, but. We actually had about 4,000 or 4,500 units, and we got it down to 3,296, because it's based on the zones, right? So we actually deleted some zones from this one and increased Chestnut Street, right? So we'll show you in a second, because it's not like you can just do a double or even 2,400, because it's based on the parcels that are already in place.
Existing parcels
The-
that are in our, in other words, who
And the
owns the
zones.
property as a.
Well, right, if there's a
The
zone.
properties the parcels as are currently configured along Chestnut Street and Highland Avenue, et cetera, okay.
Yeah,
Without a comment, thinking that some of them could be combined or otherwise, just saying how we have them currently configured.
But the zones are a certain size, so there's some smaller zones and some bigger zones, and if you do more density in some zones that are bigger, like Chestnut Street, you increase this higher, so we were really concerned about it, which is why we eliminated all housing in general residential areas.
and we also took basically, under the neighborhood housing plan, what's happening is that the greater density is happening in the Chestnut Street district. And so you're going up to a 4-story profile, but that profile is already allowed as
By
mixed
special
use
permit.
by special permit in the overlays. So what was happening is that under the neighborhood plan, we were using the underlying zoning rules, which is basically what we use 3 stories as opposed to 2.5. But in the neighborhood plan, we opened it up to what was allowed in the overlay districts. And we said, where do we want that density to happen? And it was along the Chestnut Street corridor. And that we thought we could allow for greater height in the existing apartment districts, letting them move from 3 stories to 4 stories.
The other
So
piece,
the one Charles Court East that you're talking about and here on Highland Avenue and down at Rosemary Ridge.
In Rosemary Ridge,
You're
basically,
basically contemplating that those would be torn down or
or,
4 stories built or additional stories on each of those.
that's right. Added height within those existing apartment districts and then greater density along Chestnut Street is basically what the distinctions are between the base compliance plan and the neighborhood plan.
and we eliminated some, like
And-
the Avery School.
And we decided also under the neighborhood plan that we wanted the denser development to happen closer to transit. So we did not pull that greater density in the neighborhood plan to the 2 apartment districts that are farther up Highland Avenue, north of Webster Street. We eliminated them, but
And just out of curiosity, you did, so because they're not proximate to the trains, you couldn't have included like Greendale, or the apartments behind St. Seb's as part of the plan that, to get you compliance, actually, yeah, well, like what Newton.
Right.
Was it, or Wellesley did with or Newton did with was it Wellesley that did that with the big project they just built,
That was Wellesley.
that was well, so they included that in their plan, and all of a sudden that just puts them in compliance that they included that district.
So could only be 10% outside of the half mile, and we
Got
did
it.
do it, which
Okay.
was also something that's already built not that long ago, so that it wouldn't be
Charlesport.
redeveloped again.
yeah, we looked at our existing apartment districts and we said, oh gee, where can we grab credit from?
Right.
What's up, we've already done, we've been good partners with, and we grabbed those districts.
And I probably have asked this question before, but Linden Street, the Linden Street development cannot qualify because it's restricted use, or is that right?
It's age restricted.
Age restricted?
And we can have age restriction
For this,
for the MBTA communities. And then one other thing is, when we looked at Chestnut Street, we looked at the 2 different sides of Chestnut Street. We looked at the side closest to the train station. We allowed higher density than the side that's closer to the adjacent to the residential area. So we were really careful of, and then it's numbers, like this district is bigger, so if you increase it by a half a story, it increases it by 1,000 units. We're like, whoa, hold on. So then, it was kind of moving pieces around, and that's where the model that was from RKG was super helpful to spit out the information of how many units. And all of these units that are here are 1,000 square foot units. I just wanna, and we're gonna go through it in a
Yeah.
second.
Sorry.
No, but.
I don't mean to derail you, but-
That's
That's
important
okay.
to know, because if you have, that's 1,000 square feet, right? So if you have 2-bedroom and 3-bedroom units, that count is gonna go lower. This is just a model that they did at 1,000 square feet. So that's,
Right, so if you have hallways and you have, common spaces and buildings, which is
It's
generally about a
probably
third.
a studio or 1-bedroom. Which, and that versus, but if the developer decides to do 2 and 3 stories, that count starts coming down, because you don't need,
Okay, so the next slide, maybe we'll just.
I don't know if I just confused everyone. It's just, yeah.
Sorry, I just have a question. Video room, new member, first day. So just- Very basic question, get myself situated here. What's the purpose of this? Are we trying to make more affordable housing, make it more accessible, or are we trying to meet a minimum requirement?
That one.
That one. And
Answer it,
to-
answer.
So you can answer it, yeah, well.
Okay, well, basically, we have a law that's basically requiring that Massachusetts communities adopt zoning to allow multifamily housing around transit, because in large part, there's a housing crisis in the state that we're trying to address. And so this is basically what Needham's profile is in terms of housing to create. It's, the housing that we're creating is really market rate housing. When I get into the detail of it, we are requiring that, certain larger developments of 6 or more dwelling units have provisions for affordable housing at 12.5%. And we have an incentive for workforce housing on top of that.
So we're required to adhere to this rules. What if we don't? What's the consequence?
We'll get to.
We'll get to that. It's not, Katie can tell you all the money that won't come in.
But could I also just add, I think Needham, my sense anecdotally from other communities is that we're unique in the article strategy that's on the warrant, which Lee will speak to, but we've really divorced the question about, does Needham want to comply with the law? And then second, does Needham want to add additional housing beyond that? That was something that Hone heard starting in the first community meeting, where people really were grappling with both of those questions and not wanting that decision to be merged together, where you'd be complying and maybe pushing beyond minimum compliance. So, what's going before town meeting is that they can first decide, do we want to comply? And then the second, do we think we have an added need for additional housing?
Right.
And are they comfortable with that framework so that it's kind
Got
of
it.
two clean policy choices?
Right, and exactly that, like, we can choose to comply, but the town is not sponsoring for these projects to be built, right? Like, you still need developers come in, willing
Correct.
to invest.
And in most of these districts, all that housing is already allowed. So it's just a matter of, in order to create more housing, you need to create a little more density. But in order to comply, you can pretty much do what we have right now, except change multifamily housing use to allow it in two districts, business and industrial.
But in fairness, and this is, zoning is a lot for you to come in to.
Yeah,
first meeting, so I
yeah, this is
apologize.
super heavy, yeah.
Yeah.
You're gonna find something
And-
easier.
and have we, I'm sure you have done all the homework, this is all very impressive information, how much you have done. Do we know if there is demand that for people wanting to move to Needham and living in, yeah,
So we did a study that, Carol was part of our group for that we created a master plan in town, a housing plan. And there's an incredible need for housing in Needham. The people that work here can't live here because it's too expensive. And there aren't units that are the right size for people to retire here or for young people to start housing here. Because it's a very desirable town. So that was all taken into consideration. And of course, there are people that want a ridiculous amount of housing. There are people that want no housing, and there's a lot in between. So when we were doing community meetings, we had people really pushing the housing in, but we felt uncomfortable with too much housing. That's why the neighborhood plan, even though it looks like a lot, you'll see why it's all based on the different districts. We tried to try to make it as manageable as possible to put density in the right place and not just willy-nilly just give housing for the sake of housing.
right, right.
But just to clarify though, for Lydia's benefit, that this housing and this plan still has to comply with the requirement that this housing that qualifies be within a half a mile
Correct.
from a train station. So even if let's just take the Muzzy site, not because I think it's great, but because it's not doing anything right now. You know, if the town decides actually Muzzy is where we want to put all our housing, it doesn't comply with the MBTA Communities Act because it's not within a half mile from a train station.
Yeah.
So
But
it's
there-
very specific.
Correct, you're totally correct, but if there are places like that where people want housing, and there is a component of housing on that site, right? for
So
the
there's
planning.
the allowance for it under zoning.
Yeah, it's allowed under zoning. If we want to put zoning in areas that are not necessarily related to this, we, as the planning board could review it with the town, what other areas are available that they think would be a good place for housing. One of them being Hersey. We decided that Hersey, because of the general residential district, we would have to take too many lots to change it. That would be something, and some people want it because they felt it was inequitable that Hersey didn't get housing when the other three did. We're gonna review it as a planning board with community input that's unrelated to this. So,
Thank you for that information. And we also considered bringing more people into Needham, the impact on our education system, there are more people taken away from, right?
That's part of it.
Well,
That's part of
that'll
the
be part of the
presentation.
presentation.
so the
I'm
impacts,
talking about-
yeah, no, but they're super important and we're gonna go through.
Thank you, thank you.
Okay, so this is the framework for the 4 articles in the warrant. So the first article, Article 8, basically creates the multifamily overlay and it's consistent with the plans, with the dimensional standards in the base compliance plan. And then Article 9 is the map change that's associated with that base compliance plan to actually implement Article 8. And then Article 10 is designed to build upon Article 8 and make amendments to it to allow for greater density, largely through the insertion of alternative dimensional standards and dimensional requirements as articulated in the neighborhood housing plan. And then Article 11 is a map change to allow for an amendment to Article 9 to implement the revised boundaries that are associated with the neighborhood housing plan.
So big picture is that Article 8 is the base compliance zoning, Article 10 is the neighborhood housing plan zoning, and Article 9 and 11 are just the maps for it.
Okay, so the next one, so this is basically showing you the geography of the base compliance plan and the neighborhood housing plan. I think as I told you, They both follow the Highland Avenue spine coming down from Webster Street. Following it down to Needham Center, skipping basically the Center Business District and then running down Chestnut Street. So on the base compliance side of it, it's under that A1 designation. It's capturing the existing apartment districts and it's grabbing credit for them. It's also introducing the Charles Court Apartments off of Greendale Avenue. And then it's looking at housing being introduced or revised rules happening in the business districts that frame that corridor. The neighborhood housing plan makes some modifications to that base model. Again, it follows the spine of Needham along Highland Avenue. It starts a little bit farther to the south by eliminating basically Hamilton Highlands and the Avery Square condominiums at the north. Maybe you can point.
Yeah, so this one became this to be able to reduce the amount of units because it's already developed.
And it also introduced the apartment district down by Denmark Lane. And then it began to make some distinctions along the Chestnut Street corridor, recognizing that the east and the west side are really different in terms of their orientation. The west side abuts the MBTA railroad tracks, and so you'll see there's greater height and density happening over there as opposed to on the east side and at basically the Hartney-Braemont side. And then also the Garden Street portion of it, kind of north of the center, is basically being treated at a lower density. So those kinds of distinctions will ultimately be reflected in the neighborhood housing plan. So next slide. So this is just the slide that's showing you what the dimensional requirements are. And I just want to point out that, as we mentioned earlier, that this is pretty much following the framework of what those rules are in those current districts as they relate to dimensionals, with a couple exceptions that Natasha mentioned. In the business districts currently, the maximum height under the underlying zoning is 2.5 stories. Here we're moving up a 0.5 story. The parking requirement across all the districts is 1.5 parking spaces. We're moving down to a standard of 1
For a minimum.
for a
So
minimum.
people could come in, if developers could come in and do more. We used to have a 1.5 minimum because it's near a train station. We thought 1 was more appropriate.
And then we're making some adjustments at Avery Square. Currently in Avery Square, there's an underlying zoning district which has an FAR 0.7. And for the overlay, it's a 1.1. We're moving up to a floor area ratio as of right of 1.3, which is there. And we're moving to a special permit of 1.7 and 4 stories. Currently in Avery Square, you can do 4 stories, but it's limited to 25% of the footprint of the roof. So it's pretty much, you can see, kind of following the framework with some minor modifications of what the dimensions are kind of based within those
But
districts.
that
currently.
one is very specific to
100 west.
100 West and an intended development project. Is that correct?
Correct.
I'm not sure when you're saying intent.
Well, intended is too strong of a word, I guess,
Well,
but
it's an empty building and we're looking at redevelopment, possibilities at that location, and probably that property is key to be redeveloped.
And I believe it's been empty for about 8 years. And so
But the number of 244 came from where? In terms of that development, that came from somewhere.
244.
Well, which was the negotiation regarding that building. obviously.
No, actually, I should go on to say that we've also, since the hearing, we've imposed a maximum dwelling unit per acre limit of
No,
40
I
of
understand.
44, which
Right.
basically puts a cap
No, I
at
understand.
at
But
189.
what was the impetus to start?
It wasn't really, how do I say this? We adjusted the FAR up to 1.3. And then when the model because the state model is basically taking the square footage that's generated as a function of that FAR and dividing it by 1,000. So when we increased the FAR to create the greater volume at that location, it led to the increase in number of units.
So it wasn't anybody in particular said, I would be interested in this if it had 240, if I could build 250
No.
units? Okay,
Basically, what we had was 187 units,
We had it-
189, I can't remember.
We had, I think we thought it was 187, and they indicated they wanted that amount, but that the state model, even though, which was giving them 1,000, was not going to give them 187 units. So when they had hallways and these other spaces,
Mechanical rooms, hallways, walls, exterior walls, they couldn't make the numbers work.
and so they wanted the 189 units, but they basically said they couldn't do it with 1 point.
so there, who's the they? Okay.
Yeah,
Lawyer for the developer slash or an owner of the property.
Okay,
When the owner of the property saw what, and they tried a model, they realized that they could do the units, but that the state model, which is,
Right.
just happening this year, didn't take into account the grossing factor of corridors, lobbies, elevators, stairs. So they came to us and said, we have an issue here. We can do the units you're telling us to do, but we can't do the rest of the grossing. So then when we changed the FAR, it came up to like 243 or 44 units, and then we heard from the community, wait, we don't want 244 units. The developer's like, I don't want 244, I just want 187, so we capped it at 190.
Okay.
So the grossing is allowed for the rest of it, but the units remain the same.
okay,
Could I be clarifying some specifics here? So when we're talking about on the FAR, when it was a 1.0 FAR, the square footage of the lot is around 187,000 square feet.
Mhm.
So that was 187 units, but they can't, but again, because the
Right.
corridor thing, they need more.
Right.
So that's why we upped it to 1.3. Now, correct me though, when we go to the fourth floor, we're allowing, they can build more than 190 units.
By special permit.
By special
by
permit where
special
and the
permit.
town has a say and the
Right.
community has a say.
Yeah, I just
We
wanted
were
to make sure.
concerned about the as of right,
right,
because, and that's why we talked to different attorneys about the site plan review. Because we did, I mean, once you do as of right, as we know through the Dover Amendment and other things that the state has regulated, we don't have a lot of power of as of right. So we wanted to make sure that the rules that were as of right were things we felt comfortable with.
got it.
And then the special permit then has other rules that can be imposed by the town because you have more leeway. So
One suggestion when you do your presentation at town meeting, I mean, I do think. And I was aware of this and had forgotten about it, but the fact that there is all this existing zoning that we're not making material adjustments to. Like on this chart, just as you've been going through it, if in some way you could indicate what exists today.
we do
Yeah.
have it coming up in a
Okay.
second, but
But like-
think,
Just a comparison.
but as a big picture.
well, like what Mr. Jamian said is kind of right. If you had existing zoning looking like this chart and base compliance plan kind of on one piece of paper. I
We
think
have
that
it
would
on
be
another
helpful.
table. We just didn't put it in this particular PowerPoint.
okay.
But we also are gonna go item district by
There's quite a
district.
lot of variation.
Yeah. But I think that's a great suggestion, and I think it's super helpful, and that's why I was trying to give the big picture at the beginning, because
Yeah,
there's so much information that we're missing some pretty critical pieces if we don't say them out loud.
right. But it's important. I mean, I think.
Absolutely.
Because you throw this in front of, people's. They're gonna react, you don't want them to react. Without knowledge.
Absolutely.
Right,
I move to the next one, again.
okay. So the next is the neighborhood housing plan, and I think as I said earlier, if you look at the apartment zone, in that case, under the base plan, we had a 3-story limit. It's now going to 4 stories. We had an FAR limit of a 0.5, it's now going to a 1. And we've moved up the maximum dwelling units per acre from 18 to 36. And then in the business district, it's the same, we increased the height from 3 stories to 4 stories. This is just the block across the street from the high school, the Sudbury Farms block. And to a floor area ratio of 2. And we put a maximum dwelling unit, a limit there of 48 dwelling units per acre. And we introduced the concept of trying to incentivize mixed use development or workforce housing by giving folks a half story if they exercise one of those 2 options.
I mean, how does that work practically speaking? Because these are all apartments, right? So what, what happens when they release it after the 7.5% workforce housing? Like, what's the definition?
7.5%, it's workforce housing was, the affordable housing is 80% of area median income. Workforce housing is defined as between 80% of area median income and 120% of area median income.
So it's an income test.
It's an income test, and so the 7.5% workforce housing is designed to sit on top of the 7.5 affordable units, so that 20% of the units are affordable. They're just servicing different target populations.
Okay,
But can you tell them what the AMI is? Because it's
the
not like.
AMI is different.
Right, right, yeah, but I'm sorry, the medium housing income, what is the medium housing income for this area? It's pretty high.
Yeah, I don't have it off the top of my head. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
but it's pretty high. It's not like,
109,000, I feel like.
But I thought the definition of affordable housing was changing because you were using a different index versus the median area income. I thought it was the Boston, wasn't there the Boston area income, or I thought there was like a slightly different index that was being used.
You're using what HUD defines as the standard metropolitan area to calculate that number.
But that's different than what Needham had used to calculate their affordable housing threshold prior to this.
No, we're
Isn't
using the same threshold.
it? Okay,
The
we can
defi-
clarify what that is.
I'll clarify what
That
that
would
is
be great.
and what the number is. I'm sorry, I don't have it tonight.
And the
But
reason it went up, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
To the 0.5, the half story, what purpose is that?
That half story is because when you do commercial, you need more headroom on that lower level. So because you have bigger units, because the spaces are, if you have a restaurant or whatever you have on the lower level or retail, housing requires lower on the first level, but retail requires higher. So if you're incentivizing for retail, then you have the half story.
All right, so basically your story and a half would be on your first floor and then 3 stories above that.
But you still have a cap on height.
Okay.
And-
The one opposite Unitarian Church, is that considered the 3.5 story, for example?
The which one?
The project, the development opposite Unitarian Church on 50 Dedham Ave, is that considered?
3 plus 1.
3 plus 1?
That was 3
3.5?
plus 1.
So it's
And
not
the-
3.5.
That's actually taller that's actually greater.
And the top unit, when it's 4 stories, it's set back. It has to be set back a certain amount. And we made sure that especially at 100 West, it's set back on West Street and it's set back on Highland Street. On Highland Avenue.
So continuing, I guess, to the west and the east side of Chestnut Street, we differentiated, recognizing that the west side of Chestnut Street, above the railroad tracks, we allowed for a height of 4 stories. From the 3 that you had in the base plan, and so then the incentive takes you up to the 4.5 standard. And on the east side, we kept it at 3 stories, and in both cases, we increased the FAR. And then in the Hillside Avenue district, we kept it at 3 stories. We increased the FAR to 1, and at Crescent Street, we increased the FAR to a 0.75.
And Crescent Street was another one that some community members were saying we'd like it rezoned later, differently and add more. And we said we need to do that later because we already sent the compliance with the amount of units that we have. So that's another one that we're gonna review as a community later on.
So the next slide. This is just to give you a framework, and RKG, I think, will be here at your next meeting to talk about the financials and basically the propensity for change model, though I think Katie's gonna talk a little bit about tonight. But this was just to give an idea of what the projection might be in terms of actual units to be constructed. So I think, as Natasha mentioned, from this rezoning, we did it back in 2009, which created the overlays for Needham Center. We've seen a total of 15 units, I think 10 in the Center Business District. And then at Chestnut Street and under the underlying zoning, we've got a recent development off of Oak Street, which created 5 units. But this RKG basically was trying to project from the base compliance plan and the neighborhood housing plan, what would be a likely, I think, build out over 10 years. Is that right? Okay, and so what they did was they looked at the current assessed value for each parcel in the district. And then they looked at the future value of the parcel under the zoning scenario that would apply to that particular district. And if the value increased by greater than 50% for that individual parcel, then it was deemed likely to flip. And so then the number of units that were being generated in that scenario was calculated for the base compliance plan and then for the neighborhood housing plan. So you can see I think it's 411 under the base compliance and 1,288 under the neighborhood plan.
And I
So
just,
we're really. The big building is gonna happen on Chestnut Street.
Well-
In simple terms, I mean, it just, if you look at that chart, that's what it speaks to, right? Is that Chestnut Street East, West and Garden, that's where the big stuff's gonna happen.
if everyone sells their land to one person.
No, but regardless of, right.
Because all the units are chiclets, yeah.
No, I know that part, but I'm just following the plan. I'm not looking at
But that's what we said, we could
units.
live with it there if one person decides to buy everything, right? We could live with it on the Chestnut Street corridor that is missing, has a lot of missing teeth and a lot of parking lots.
And we wanted Chestnut Street to redevelop. I think we were disappointed under the Needham Center plan. It called for 4-story profile on that street and we're just not seeing it. And part of the problem is this fractionalized ownership, people with buildings, living in Florida and tenants are paying rent and there's just
They're
no
happy,
desire
yeah.
to turn it over. And so it's not turning over.
Was one part of the problem also the special permit aspect of it?
It also has,
Yeah, that's right.
it's not as of
But it's
right.
also, when you look compared to Great Plain Avenue and Highland Avenue, it's a much narrower street. There's more intersections, there's no capital plan to do anything on that street. It just strikes me when I look at that and see so many numbers on Chestnut Street, which seems like the least capable road as it stands right now, in its configuration. Width and otherwise, of being able to withstand that kind of density, just my own personal opinion, just pointing that out.
But we're trying to increase it, right? Because that's a place that it would be great to be increased. There are restaurants there. There's a hospital, there are all these pieces, and it's just kind of, it hasn't happened. Even with changes that happened in 2009, it still hasn't happened. So I agree with you. That's why we're saying these things aren't gonna happen, even if they're super conservative because of it. And to tell you the truth, Avery Square was 0 until we made the changes because the propensity, the likely build out wasn't working out because you couldn't build on that site with what we had done before.
And Lee, do you have any sense that if you're moving from an as of special permit to as of right, that you've heard from developers that will really drive them to do something? Like, do you have a sense that this is the plan that will finally move Chestnut Street's needle at all?
I'm hopeful. Some developers say yes to that question and other developers say it doesn't really matter. We understand there's a special permit process in Needham and we're used to going through the hoops. So, there are some developers, smaller scale developers who are telling us that an as of right process will make it more predictable for them and that they'll be more likely to move forward.
And Bill was one of the ones that was helping us with the density of Chestnut Street. He was the one and he's a developer, but he had in mind the character of what we wanted to keep and what would actually work. Every time we would be like, do you think anybody would do anything, So we tweaked it based on his input, which I thought was pretty important.
During the hone process, we asked the Council of Economic Advisors to host a meeting for us and to bring developers in so we could ask these questions. We asked about height and density, but other things like what really would be driving your decision making. And to echo Lee's point, we really got a mixed response around as of right versus special permit. And I think bigger firms that have the ability to have holding costs and maintain risk were okay going through a special permit process, and
Okay.
others were not. If they were smaller or just didn't have that much ability to kind of sustain over the long term any uncertainties. The flip side, though, is that the bigger firms also are more likely to be able to aggregate the parcels. So, there's a lot at play, and we didn't hear one kind of resounding message.
Can you reiterate the logic and that you used on the likely build numbers? Because I look at these numbers and in the base compliance plan, 411 units, that's like 20% of what we'd be zoning for. Why so low? Is it because of the history here, or? So I'm hearing two things. I'm hearing there's only been like one proposed project. But then I also hear if you zone this, maybe we're gonna attract more developers. So how did you come to these percentages for the likely build?
Eric Halverson from RKG is going to join you at the meeting on the 9th, and we've asked him to prepare the full methodology and conclusion for the likely build out, because the report in April didn't reflect the final zoning. But at a very simple level, the analysis was about what's the value of the parcel today versus the potential value under each zoning scenario. And it was generated on a per parcel basis. So he has the actual kind of parcel IDs and GIS with the assessed value. So it's less about, you know, is it going to be 1/3 of base and 1/3 of neighborhood, and more specific to what is going to change for that particular parcel under each zoning scenario. And it doesn't generate enough added value that we think it will drive somebody to flip that parcel.
That's it.
I want to add another thing, there's NA here for center business, because we're not changing the zoning in the center business, because there's already an overlay for housing there. But we're not changing anything here, so it says NA, so if anybody wants to, you know, but it would be through a regular process, not through the MBTA communities
Was
process.
part of that also related to the MBTA community? Was gonna be a little potentially too restrictive if we were trying to deal with zoning in the center?
No, I
Also?
think the reason was the MBTA Communities Act was requiring housing on the first floor. And we didn't want to see housing on the first floor. In the center, we wanted to preserve the retail, commercial uses on the first floor.
Which we're doing a special permit on the other, in the other zones.
So if we do any change to the center, will be coming from our own.
Right, but
normal
it's not
process.
calculated here, so
Yeah.
it could add units if somebody decides to do it, but it would be through a regular process, right, Liam?
Yes. So the next slide, so this kind of walk you through the different districts and the base plan and in the neighborhood plan. So in the base compliance plan, I think I mentioned we were grabbing the apartment districts. So there are 4 apartment locations that are being grabbed in the base compliance plan. I think on slide A was the Avery School in Hamilton Highlands. Slide B was the Highlands, which is by St. Joe Church. On slide C is Rosemary Ridge, Rosemary Lake Apartments, and on D, the area kind of off the quarter was Charles Court Appointment Apartments. And you can see from the table, looking at the existing zoning rules and the base compliance rules, that the only thing that's changing is the parking requirement. So next slide.
So those are the existing apartment districts, correct?
As of right. In the current,
And that's as of right in our
Okay.
current zoning, so really nothing's changing
Right.
there, effectively, except the parking
Right.
requirement.
right,
Okay, so
Does
the
it make a
next,
difference if some of them are condominiums as opposed to apartments, or they're all, whether you're a condominium or apartment, it's all considered an apartment?
it's all considered multifamily, ownership or rental doesn't count, doesn't, is a
That's
non-countable variable.
apartment, yeah, it says. apartment,
Zoning
it's really
can't
multifamily.
regulate it. So, the next one is basically for the neighborhood housing plan, so, it carries forward under slide A, I think, the Highlands, that was in the base plan. It carries forward, with Rosemary Ridge condos. It introduces, Denmark Lane, which, is currently zoned industrial, but has apartments on it, so it's proposed to be rezoned to apartments. It introduces a parcel at Honeywell Street and Highland Avenue, which is basically where the Suites of Needham are located, and it carries forward with Charles Court. What's not in the neighborhood plan are those 2 other districts I talked that are farther up, Hamilton Highlands and the Avery School, Avery School. And what it does is it increases the height from 3 stories to 4 stories. It increases the FAR from the 0.5 to the 1.0, and it increases the maximum dwelling units per acre from 18 to 36. So within existing apartment or condo development, you're allowing greater height. And you're allowing, basically, a higher FAR, number of units per acre.
but basically you'd have to redo these existing properties. Correct?
Correct.
So,
Right.
so there's, as you already said, there's no green space to do something de novo. You would actually have to purchase one of these developments and
But one of the people that own it would have to decide they want to put an extra,
Right.
you know, story on a building, or maybe there's a building that's old and they want to redevelop it.
Right?
Like Charles Court could put another floor on, you know.
Floor on it,
But in general, that wouldn't be financially viable because the structure of the building was not
Right.
built to hold
Right.
another
Right.
story.
Where's-
So they probably wouldn't do it. They'd probably tear it down and build new.
Right.
Oh, mhm.
so that's what's happening in the, so the next one I think is the business district. So here we're at the Sudbury Farms block across from the high school. This is a district that currently does not allow housing. So housing is being allowed in this district as a new use. So under the base plan, it's pretty much following the existing zoning again, except for the parking adjustment that's happening. And under the housing plan, we're introducing the greater height, we're introducing the greater FAR. We're introducing to limit the number of dwelling units, a 48 dwelling unit per acre cap. And we're providing the incentive of that half story, if it's mixed use or 7.5% of it has workforce housing.
Is this true? The only reason that this is NA is because housing is not allowed in the business district.
No, the floor area, the reason that's an NA is that is the only business district that hasn't been updated in Needham probably in the last 30 years in terms of its zoning profile. So it's still working under these old rules that were, an FAR hasn't even been introduced into that district. It's the only business district that hasn't been updated in its existing profile. Okay, so the next one is Avery Square. And so, under the existing, so Avery Square basically has an underlying zoning district, and then it has an overlay that sits on top of 100 West, which is the parcel we're talking about rezoning. And so the floor area ratio in the underlying district is 0.7. And it's a 1.1 within the overlay, and what's proposed in the base plan is moving that up to a 1.3 and putting a cap on the number of dwelling units as of right at 44, which yields your 189 units. And then authorizing the planning board to issue a special permit up to 1.7. And also an increase in the number of dwelling units per acre by special permit. And that district allows for 4 stories, but it's constrained to 35% of the total roof area. And that constraint will go away. You can cover the entire roof.
But you can it needs to be pushed back on both streets.
Yeah,
But
it's
it-
pushed back.
But
It's
it's,
a
yeah,
setback.
right, it's pushed back on both streets, and there, if you look at the design standards that are embedded in the zoning now, there are restrictions on garage location. It can't be on the front of the building. It needs to be integrated with the architecture of the building, so it's not visible. The same,
Mechanical overruns have caps, like we've capped everything, because if it's gonna be as of right, we wanna make sure that we understand what the caps are for height and for use, right?
right,
I have one question just for you to see if you think it's better. Really, the floor area ratio is 0.7, but the overlay is 1.1. Would it be worth putting the overlay? Because from 1.1 to 1.3 is not as much of a leap as from 0.7.
Well, with the overlay, it's 1.1, so it's not really 0.7, right?
That's what I'm
Correct,
saying,
that one.
because this is existing zoning, and then
Correct.
there's the overlay.
Correct.
It's super complicated, but I'm just.
yeah, maybe we should.
But you're
Well,
numbers people, so would it be worth to put
Yes.
the overlay saying you're really
Yes.
jumping from 1.1 to
Right.
1.3? And the only reason is because they couldn't get quarters and mechanical units, right? So to get the gross factor of the building.
I think the answer, I think it's clear we should, because that's really what's going on.
Yeah, because this looks like we're almost doubling it when we're
Right.
not. Okay,
Okay,
I agree. I think we should do that.
On this one, so there's 187 units,
89.
189. Has there been any feedback about reducing the parking per unit? Because this is going to be a highly populated area. Not only with the residents who live there, but guests who are coming in and out. And there's not a ton of parking on the street.
this is a minimum. Are you saying reduce the minimum?
Why was
To
the parking per
0.5?
unit reduced from 1.5 to 1? why didn't you keep it at 1.5?
Because it's a minimum, so if we're right next to the train station, if people don't want to have more than one, you know, if the developer feels like they could sell it with one unit. Because there's a MBTA station, then, I mean, every time we have a developer come in. The first thing they do is ask for a parking reduction because our parking is, right? It's crazy how many, and I think like Muzzy was like, I don't know, like 1,700 parking spaces or something. And they all come back because it makes no sense. We have super antiquated parking minimums. So-
Actually, there was a study that was done by the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, which looked at how much actually parking was necessary at multifamily developments. And they looked at a couple of projects in Needham and discovered that we're really overparked in terms of our numbers, and that's why we came. And there was also another study that was done by Stantec, looking at the center area in terms of what was actually required at these developments as a function of how many cars were sitting in parking spaces. And we discovered that we really have a number that's generating too high a standard for what the real demand is, and why have the asphalt out there if it's not necessary. And that's why the adjustment was made.
Yeah, I was talking to a young man today, very nice young man, and he was in favor of maximum, like maximum one, a maximum five, things like that. These people are saying we need to change our whole view of cars, but yes, minimum is one. Is again, the aspect
they
is.
can do as
Yeah,
many as
it's,
they
yeah, they
want
can
if
be
it
more if they
works.
want, if that fits their business model, but it's right next to the train station. So the goal is to reduce cars. That's the goal.
So the next one is the Chestnut Street District, under the base, compliance plan. Oh, go back. I think you skipped ahead. Okay, so this is Chestnut Street. And Chestnut Street's made up of, of two areas. Area A is the Garden Street between May Street and Great Plain Avenue. And the other is on Chestnut Street from Great Plain Avenue to, the junction. And you can see the underlying zoning, is pretty much being mirrored here. The only change is that half story from 2.5 to 3 stories. And the parking space reduction in the base compliance plan.
Which is it?
So next one. So this is the neighborhood housing plan. It's the same districts are called out. But we're creating, Chestnut Street East and basically, A is still the Garden Street. And then, and then B basically has Chestnut Street East and Chestnut Street West, because we wanted to have different standards with greater density on the west side as opposed to the east side of Chestnut. So in the neighborhood plan on the east side, and at the Hartney Graymont property and at Garden Street, we are retaining 3 stories. That's not going up. On the west side of Chestnut, though, we are allowing it to go to 4 stories, which is what currently exists in the overlay. And we're
So here we
allowing,
did add it, so we should do that to
yeah.
100 West.
And then in the FAR is really not changing from what we have in the overlay. It's a 2. The parking is reduced. And then basically an incentive of a half story is added at Chestnut East and Chestnut West for the mixed use or for the workforce housing.
And I mentioned when it comes to commercial, you need the extra space on the lower level, but in general, the half story could, if it's all housing, it could be that it's just basically the sloped roof, right? Because it's to get some more space on another level. So we have, in all the community meetings, we've been showing examples of what these things are. So it's pretty similar to what we currently have in the overlay.
So you're saying the half story is more like the top floor, the top floor essentially has a sloped roof
Right,
going into. it.
right, and that's in the design guidelines.
What is it, do you know offhand what the current number of units exist just in Chestnut Street East and West?
We have that.
The new one that we just did was 5. I have it in another table.
Just, because it's mostly commercial.
We have that number in another slide.
Okay.
We'll get it to you. We broke it out by how many units total exist on the ground
Right.
across districts.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I know, and actually, I think it's maybe in the beginning of this presentation.
I think it was in the September 5th public hearing PowerPoint presentation, which
I have, okay. I can look it up while you're.
Okay. Okay, so I guess the next one is Hillside Avenue Business. Next slide. So this is, Hillside Avenue Business, for the base plan and the housing plan. You can see the base plan is just, again, that extra height, of a half a story. And it pretty much retains the, foundational standards, that you have within the, existing zoning. And then the housing, plan allows just for a slightly higher FAR, so a slightly larger building volume and puts a cap on number of dwelling units.
Yeah, I found it here. So the Chestnut Street has 46 existing units. And the new existing zoning unit capacity is 370, and the existing zoning with overlay is 987. So that's where most of the additional, so in total,
Right,
the largest are the apartments. Existing units are 588. Existing zoning unit capacity is 526, and the existing zoning with overlay is 526. But that's the one, so
Right.
the total units for existing units for the whole town is 775.
but I'm just in particular for Chestnut Street, where we're really focusing, trying to target development, currently is only 46 units.
Kind of disappointing.
That
mean-
exist.
No, I just know how difficult it
exists.
is to, just my knowledge of the hospital, trying to, who wants to expand, the difficulty of.
Well, I remember years ago when the zoning was talked about for that district and how there was excitement about,
Right.
we're zoning this, or
Right.
something,
Well,
and nothing happened.
we did, whatever it was, 14 years ago, we did that. Okay,
Okay, so the next one is the industrial district, and there are 3 industrial districts that we're looking at. On slide A, it's basically the Hillside Industrial District located at Hillside Avenue that runs between West Street and Rosemary. On slide B, it's basically the Crescent Road Industrial District, and on slide C, it's the Denmark Lane Industrial District off of Great Plain Avenue. And you can see, and I guess in this district, housing is not allowed, and we're introducing it. And because we have a lot coverage requirement and not an FAR, we're substituting a lot coverage requirement for an FAR. To get what we think is a comparable result, and the parking is going down, so it's following the existing zoning profile.
But you said, I thought Denmark Lane does have housing now.
It has housing now, but it's zoned industrial. So it's probably pre-existing non-conforming.
Okay.
Yeah, so the next slide is what the industrial districts would be under the neighborhood housing plan. I think I mentioned we moved Denmark Lane into the A1 category, which is why it's not represented here in the neighborhood housing plan. So we just are retaining the district located at Hillside Avenue and the one that's located at Crescent Road. In this case, at Crescent, we're increasing the FAR from a 0.5 to a 0.75. At Hillside Avenue, we're increasing it to a 1, and we're imposing a maximum dwelling unit per acre limit. So in this district, I mean, is some increase in volume, but it's minimal. So now I'm just gonna talk about process, how would these be processed by the planning board? So we're talking about doing a site plan approval. And so all the applications would be reviewed by the planning board, and there would be a public hearing process. I think it's important to recognize that this is an as of right process. So the planning board can't deny an application if it meets the building and setback and development standards, because multifamily housing is allowed by right. But that said, it can impose reasonable conditions on lighting, on fencing, on stormwater, on traffic, on adjusting parking lot layout, etc.
Landscape, wasn't landscaping in there?
And landscaping. And it can impose conditions to shape the project, but the conditions cannot go so far as to become an impediment to redevelopment.
But this is one of the things that we were looking at other towns, and we were looking at two things that were brought up by different attorneys, one of them being the character of the neighborhood. We put that back in a way that it allows us to comply. And then there was one other piece that we put in that was, do you remember, related
Yeah,
to?
right.
Well, we expanded the develop, when we drafted the zoning, we had a certain set of development standards that developers would have to meet for the site plan approval. And based upon what we heard at the hearings and the input we got from some of the attorneys in town, we expanded that, as Natasha said, to include standards to ensure that the buildings were designed with respect to a relationship to their existing environment, open spaces around them. That there was adequate, and it was clear, water, sewer, and utility service to just provide to the project, that there was adequate pedestrian and vehicular movement, and that the town was able to impose reasonable mitigation, off-site on traffic that was related to the project. And then we
With a
include
licensed engineer, not just someone going out there and figuring it out.
by a licensed
Yeah.
traffic engineer, and that there were, provisions that we could apply on this project to control the actual construction management as it was happening.
So I take that to mean then factors such as 4.5 story building, how it might affect the sunlight to an adjoining property. Is that something that we can consider under this or not? I was using that as just one example. In other words, effects on adjoining properties, whether it's stormwater, light, traffic, anything that the property might do that might have effect on its four neighbors or adjoining. Will we be able to do all those things through this process that we're
I
proposing?
think that's design review, right?
I think the
That's
design
my
review board can make recommendations. I think the presumption is that your dimensionals accomplish those
So I
goals.
can have my 4.5 stories, but if I completely outshade my neighbor next to me.
You can't
But
say no.
we
There's
looked
nothing,
at
there's
that.
not, there's nothing we can do about
We-
it, under this proposal.
We were looking at a line item under the existing site plan review, which talked about some aspect of it. And that wasn't one that we brought back in. Because I believe we were, as Chris Heap was talking about, as of right.
And we did, we brought,
What we could bring back in, and his concern about as of right, is we definitely had a long conversation about various items. We weren't specifically talking about the shadowing, but as you're aware, I think about shadowing, but that wasn't.
But we
brought up.
did.
I was just
we did
using
it
that as
during-
one example.
That's a
There's
great
a lot of
example.
things
No, it's a
that,
great
that
example.
affect adjoining
Yeah,
properties
it's a
that
great example.
I'd hate to lose the ability to
Yeah.
have that as part of our discussion on these projects.
But like the Dover Amendment, you're limited to site plan review, so we were trying to make it as positive as possible to be able to say that at least we could review those pieces. Normally, it doesn't allow you to review it, and what other towns did is made it murkier, and we felt that and then they might end up not having any review, so we at least put that it needs to be with the character, that it was, it had different criteria, but we did look at when we were in Hone, we did look at the sizes of the buildings, at the orientation of the sites and all of that. So we did look at if everything was built up, what would it look like, right? Which it won't be because you have existing buildings in some of these areas. But we did look at that to make sure that none of it was imposing in areas. That's why we have one side of the street 4 stories and one side of the street 3 stories.
Yeah, for example, when we were looking at West Street, I was looking at, okay, is that building at a certain height gonna shadow the common, for example? So I was looking at that aspect, then if we're looking as.
Well,
Natasha-
just think of Chestnut Street West.
Yeah.
And those properties that go right up to the train tracks, and then their houses just on the other side of those train tracks, and 4.5 stories gonna have a significant bearing on the sunlight that's gonna come into those houses. Just on the other side of those railroad tracks, it's not like they border on the railroad tracks, so it's basically like they neighbor them.
But we have dimensional requirements, so they have to be a certain, from the street, they have to be a certain dimension. So there's dimensional and density.
Setback from the back property line, there was some setback, but you're correct, in general, you're correct.
okay, so next one. So then lastly, we do have an affordable housing provision in this, so for developments of 6 or more dwelling units, they're required to have 12.5% of all their new units set aside as affordable housing, which means 80% of area median income. As part of the state's process, they want to make sure that whatever threshold we set on affordable housing that goes above their recommended 10%, that it's economically feasible. And RKG did do an analysis for us, which supports the recommendation of the 12.5%. And 12.5% is pretty much the standard we have for most of Needham's existing zoning districts, and it will allow us, I think, to stay ahead of that 10% affordable standard that we need to meet the 40B requirements without falling under that statute.
So if it's a 6-unit development, would that require 1 unit or 12.5% is less than a unit?
It's 12.5%,
Average up.
you average up,
The one.
you always average up.
Can we go back just one slide on site plan review? So there were some bullet points in here about infrastructure improvements. And it says that the applicant can't be required to fund infrastructure improvements, and the town isn't under obligation to make investments in it either. So if there is a sizable development that does require, and we determine that the infrastructure is insufficient,
Which is
Who
why we
bears-
added to the site plan review. You have it here in front of you. We did add something saying that,
We say there shall be adequate water, sewer, and utility service provided to service the project, so if it doesn't have it, it's not entitled to an approval, it needs to provide that.
but also Katie's gonna talk about all, what she's been talking with DPW with all the different groups about where we are with all the utilities. But we just added that because we felt like it's as of right, but we still need to have some understanding that the town is not gonna be financing some of these things, including the parking by a licensed engineer.
And is that the same with any required traffic mitigation? Or is that murkier?
No, we tried to make it
We added that
within
to,
reason. Chris Heath was like, within reason. Added to it that it needs to have a traffic engineer, a licensed traffic engineer. To assess the impact.
so it says pedestrian vehicular movement within and outside the project site shall be protected through selection of egress points, provision of adequate site distance, and through reasonable mitigation measures for traffic attributable to the project. So we can look at that.
So we have a lot more control going back to 100 West Street. If they went to the 4th story with 1.7, then we'd have special permit. Then we actually have some real say.
Well, we have a lot to say then.
Yeah, a lot of say then
Special
of what's
permit.
going on. Yeah, special, what's going on
But
outside.
it's the as of
outside the
right.
building. Yeah,
It's the as of right that we were worried
Yeah.
about because you're losing some of a lot of the site plan review control. And so that's why we had others take a look at it and give us feedback, and the community gave us feedback.
yeah, which is why we spent an hour and a half or more the other
Right.
night trying to say, what can we put back into site plan review?
Without,
and does this only, can any of these projects go to major project, site plan review, special permit, or because it's as of right, you can only do site plan review?
oh, you can do it.
And this zoning basically gives you a category that you can fall into. I mean, the existing zoning is still there. You have the option of exercising it. This is just another option. Although I would imagine if you have an as of right option, why would you go through a process that's gonna be more cumbersome?
Special permit.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can always do everything with our existing zoning. It's just MBTA Communities requires you to allow for the zoning if that's what they choose to do.
Yeah.
But if that's what they choose to do, we have to be careful that our rules make us feel comfortable. That if it is as of right, that the community feels comfortable with our review.
Yeah.
Right, so and that's the tricky part, to tell you the truth. And we extended one extra meeting last week just to talk about it for 2 hours. Because we could have got, well, I said, okay, so are we missing anything? So we went item by item because we didn't want to miss something that was in our regular site plan review. And what Wellesley did is say, just use your bylaws, but adhere to MBTA Communities, which is super murky, and it would be the same situation we're in for the Dover Act here, which we should review too.
So a pivot now.
So
I
just
feel like
go
it's
through
not
it.
now.
But the requirement that you do on often your big projects now is where you ask for peer review. In other words, you say, or you guys do a peer review of their engineering study or something along those lines, and you make them pay for it. we
can still
won't
do
have
that.
that ability through this, is that
I,
correct?
but I think we do have that ability. I will double check it. I don't know why we wouldn't have the possibility of doing a peer review.
Okay, I'd just like to see where.
But
They have to
I'll
meet- they
verify
have to
it.
meet compliance, so engineering usually reviews it. Right now, it doesn't matter if it's as a right or special permit, engineering, everyone.
No, but I mean, actually having someone else, you know, if engineering can't get to it or something like that, having say, you have a bunch of peer reviewers who you. have
Yes,
on your
and we
roster to
used
look
it
at
on 1680, we used it on Central Avenue, which was an as of right project, but I will verify that we can use it in this case. and
Well, I think you're
confirm
talking
it.
about having the applicant
Pay for it.
paid
Yeah.
for it.
But we, having, instead of burdening further our engineering group and our other groups who are so busy saying, this is our roster of peer reviewers. We're gonna have we want to have your proposal reviewed by for peer review by someone else. You applicant pay for it. But just so we make sure it's, you know, what they're saying is adding up and someone is independently verifying that. Just wanna see if we do or do not have that.
I'll
as
confirm
part
it.
of
I
this.
think we do, but I will confirm it with Chris
Yeah.
Thank you.
and let you know.
Okay, great. Chair, if you're amenable, Kara Lustig is also, I'm wondering if we can bring her over, just if there's any follow-up questions on the capital stuff as we dive in. So as I mentioned at your meeting on the 9th, we will have our KG associates here to talk through the propensity for change that created the likely unit build out. And he'll also talk through the fiscal impact analysis, which is on the operating budget side and.
And that is not in, those slides are not in this.
Correct, those will all be for the 9th.
Okay.
He's updating all of that data from the final voted zoning from the planning board from last Tuesday.
But some of those slides were in the public hearing, weren't they? There
Based
were
on the
some-
zoning at that point, and it
Okay.
got changed, yes. Yeah.
And can I just ask actually, is that the planning board question, or maybe to home? Have we done a peer review on RKG? In other words, they've done these pretty intricate analysis that, I think could be subject to debate, scrutiny, however, whatever term you want to use. You know, how they determine how many students per unit and how fiscal impact and things like that. Have we done an independent check of that to say, like a second opinion, like if someone said, you know, John, your knee's in really bad shape, and my doctor says I'm gonna chop it off, and I say, you know, I'm gonna have another doctor look at it. Have you guys done that with RKG?
So I'd say we've done three things that I think get to kind of quality control and fact checking. First, in the procurement process, we built in kind of what level of expertise are we expecting? You have to show us that you've done like comparable work. You have to have references. We interviewed them. So that was kind of before we hired RKG as the consultant. When we were working with them on the methodology for the fiscal impact, we had them meet and present to our finance staff, so deputy town manager, director of finance, the finance assistant superintendent on the school side, our director of assessing, to really
How about the finance committee? They could have come and talked to us.
very fair point.
But you left us out. I feel like I'm on an island. I mean, it's like, I come to all these meetings and they didn't bother to come talk to us.
I think that's a fair point. You know, I think we use the resources that we had in in-house expertise to say, what data can we provide to the consultant to use, and do we think their methodology makes sense to us? But it's a well-made point. And then
But
we've
Katie,
had
excuse me,
fiscal.
To be fair, we also had Josh, it was on our group, right? So he was asking questions throughout the
Sure.
entire thing. So I just don't, it's not that we didn't want to include you at all. We had a representative of your group in the group.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess the
And
answer is
then-
no, and those are the controls in place, but outside, and those controls are
Well-
good ones and they're worthy ones, but outside of those controls, was there anyone sort of other or independent who looked at their analysis and said, yeah, that checks out, or no, I don't.
We
think it
didn't
checks
hire another consultant to fact check this consultant, but we do have examples from previous fiscal analyses from other zoning and other development projects in town. So we have, just two that come to mind, Connery Associates had done fiscal impact when the Kendrick was being proposed. Barrett Associates had done a fiscal impact on the zoning at Highway Commercial 1. And so we had those methodologies that we could compare, and that was a good point of fact check for us, you know, and they use very similar methods.
Thank you.
So, great. So in terms of capital impact assessment, just methodology wise, the starting point really for that discussion was the unit projections, the student projections, and the potential population growth that comes out of the RKG analyses. And then we really looked to our internal experts in the departments that Natasha had already mentioned, but DPW, the schools, finance, building, police, and fire. And really, we sat down and did a deep thought exercise around what do we know to be the capital infrastructure that's in place in the zoned areas? What do we know are the known needs? So what do we know needs to change, whether the zoning happens or not? And how are we planning for those already in our capital planning documents? And then what do we think could be a capital impact explicitly attributable to the zoning? And that we're not already planning for to address regardless. So I'll go through high level, kind of the conclusions for each department. There's a broader memo in your packet and happy to dive into anything more. So for police and fire, no anticipated capital impacts. That's really because the town has done a lot of investment recently, both in Fire Station 2 and the public safety building. The fire chief confirmed that from an equipment standpoint, they're already serving buildings of greater height and density than what's being proposed here. And so they felt comfortable that there wouldn't be any additional apparatus needs. On the next slide.
Where do you put police cars, for example, or fire trucks to be able to service 5,000 to 10,000 more residents? Is that capital or is that operational? The
Police cars are in operating, and operating police cars, thank you. They don't tend to have a life that expands 5 years. And then the fire department, in terms of apparatus, they didn't think that population would drive it. For them, it would be building size.
And where does labor force go? Is that operational?
Operating, yeah.
And EMS, there's no additional ambulance required based on a certain population increase or.
Not at this point. They're not anticipating now. And I would say too, in our discussions with the chief about building uses, for example, 100 West being previously a nursing home, they had a lot of calls, it being switched to multifamily housing. He's like, we will have many fewer calls. So it's also a use trade-off and kind of what's the current use versus housing. And their call rates vary for residential versus other uses. Schools, I know this is a huge interest to all of us. So I will walk through kind of the inputs and then the outputs. And I did get a question from Molly on school capacity analysis that differs from the original slide. So I'll hand out a handout to be able to answer the questions that we got sent in advance. But for school enrollment projections, the things that really drive students in multifamily housing, first is the unit distribution. So studio and 1 bedrooms are likely not to generate students. 2 bedrooms and 3 bedrooms generate at higher rates increasingly. Affordability also drives students. So affordable units tend to have more students than market rate. So both of those are factored into this analysis. The breakdown of the unit distribution, RKG pulled from CoStar, which is a development database for the region, and the affordability percentages are what is baked into the zoning proposal that's in the warrant. Since the Hone report in April, I just want to note that 2 things really substantively have changed. A more conservative rate is applied for 2-bedroom market and 2-bedroom affordable. And previously, because under the Hone proposed zoning, Avery Square wasn't kind of kicking into that likely to build scenario, those units weren't accounted for. They now are accounted in these figures, so that 189 units from 100 West is now reflected. And so the table shows the school age children ratios. Again, these are pulled from residential demographic multipliers, which is kind of a statewide standard. That's a bit outdated. It's from 2017, but it's the most updated of that report that's available. And then Needham Public School actuals, which I'll speak to a little bit more on the next slide, please. So this table shows The students projected, under each scenario, the base likely and full build, the neighborhood housing plan and full build. On average, this is a rate of 0.13 students per unit. We've had a lot of questions about how we've been able to fact check that, and is that an appropriate rate to bake into this projection? And the two ways that we've been able to validate that are to look at the actual generation rates of students coming out of Charles River Landing, the Kendrick and Modera over the last 5 years. The average, the details are in the memo in your packet, but the average rate of students across those 3 properties has been 0.124, I believe. And so we felt comfortable that this was in the right ballpark. And then I think importantly for me, we've been doing a lot of coordination with the schools. So the schools update their enrollment projections every year through the Future School Needs Committee. McKibben Demographics is the consultant they've used for a number of years. We met with the principal at McKibben, went through the ratios that I just shared on the previous slide, asked if he was comfortable with those. He was, and will now be incorporating those same into the enrollment forecast for the Needham Public Schools enrollment moving forward, so that really we didn't want to have dueling enrollment projections, right? Related to the zoning and then related to the schools.
So 2 things on that, Katie, if I may,
Yeah.
were any of the conversations with McKibben memorialized either by him or by you guys with respect to what it is you said to him and what it is he said to you, and who confirmed what for whom? In other words, other than you telling me this, and I'm not doubting he didn't say that, but where do I read what the discussion was, what you presented to him, what he presented to you?
I think it's summarized, I know it's summarized in my memo on school enrollment analysis and Ann Gulati's original memo to the Future School Needs, but it doesn't give a kind of a blow by blow. So I think, I guess, maybe.
That's fine,
I'm
so
not
there isn't, that's
understanding
okay,
the
it doesn't
question.
have to, I
Yeah.
wouldn't say there has to be, I
Yeah.
just wondering if there was. because I-
So Lee,
I wanted to-
myself,
I
and
wanted to-
Gulati met with Jerry McKibben, and the 4 of us discussed, are these reasonable assumptions? Is this something we would be comfortable, exclusive of RKG's recommending this? Are we comfortable with these figures?
Now, how about either in your discussions with him or otherwise was consideration given to, I understand how you're allocating the students per the units, but what sort of discussion or consideration was given to with the availability of these units in town? People like myself or who have no school children would be attracted to move into these, and then our house will now be available for students, for, young people to populate the bedrooms that aren't populated in my house now, and I'm sure there's plenty of others who are like that, so. Now, so we have an ability to stay in town, which we want to do. There's now opportunities to do so with housing, which would be great. But other than the school numbers for the units, how about the effect on the rest of the town, and what consideration was given to that or has been given to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just so I'm understanding correctly, would more students end up in single family homes because those are being freed up?
Correct.
Okay.
In simple
Um,
terms, yes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure. So we did discuss it, and our conclusion was we didn't feel like we could ground any projections in any reasonable data to give like a number answer to that. McKibben does a much more holistic forecast, as you know, in the enrollment projections. And so they include demographic shifts, like when is there a baby boom in the cohorts of age, birth rates, shifts in single family, the turnover of single family homes. So we didn't feel like we could make any guesses about what that might look like related to the zoning. But the way that we'll monitor that over time really is through McKibben's update for school enrollment, because he's already going to be looking at, are we seeing a flip of not just 100 single family homes per year, but is it now 150?
Right.
So good question, and not something that we felt like we really felt comfortable crystal balling.
But maybe not crystal balling, but maybe putting some sort of contingency factor in there for it or something along those lines, just to make it kind of like, just so we're considering apples to apples really, and something in a holistic view is, McKibben, as you know, we're not gonna have his work this year until after we vote this in a few weeks. And so he's gonna be looking at things and you're giving him things as he should to see if these things go through what, you know, what he's seeing, how that's gonna forecast, not only in these apartments, but also in all the single family homes. And so we don't have the benefit of that due to timing, to have, you know, the benefit of his work and his report by voting on October. And I'm wondering that, was there any consideration given to some sort of contingency? I understand that you can't be a crystal ball, but that there really should be some accounting for that as a very likely possibility.
I'm not sure that McKibben would even answer that question this December with the updates for the schools. I think it's something that would be monitored over time. So one thing that he does already include is, when do we think people are gonna hit an age where they have to move out, even if they don't want it from their single family home, like they're just not capable? And he makes some assumptions about that age and how many people are in that cohort. The age range of folks who physically could stay in their homes, but maybe are prompted to leave, I think we don't know, are they already doing that and just moving somewhere that's not Needham, because we don't have those units, and so then they would be staying in Needham. It felt like a lot of variables to make assumptions about that we didn't have a solid footing on.
Thank you.
So, from the student projections, we then turn to, okay, what does that mean from a capital perspective? And that really gets into the school building capacity analysis. Let me send this around. The question that came through, Molly, that wasn't included in your packet was, could we do the school building capacity analysis, not just in comparison with the school master plan, but with existing current capacity of our existing schools? So what's coming around speaks to that. So in terms of how we did this analysis, as I mentioned, McKibben does 15-year projections for the schools. We started with taking, and actually maybe if you go to the next slide, it'll be easier for people to walk through the chart while I verbalize the methodology. So we took the peak year enrollment for each level, school levels, in that first row, and this is repeated base likely build and neighborhood likely build. And then for adding the RKG enrollment projection, I took a conservative approach and applied for the elementary level all of the students that RKG is projecting. So pretending that they all walked into elementary school that first year. For middle school, we applied 20, which comes from the MSBA letter. I can speak to that if there are questions, but it comes out to be about a third of the overall student projection for middle. And for high school, we applied half of the RKG student enrollment projections. Punchline for this is that we know what the percentage of elementary school students, middle and high school are relative to the total district population, and these are all high estimates. So a higher percentage than we anticipate. Putting those two together gives total enrollment projection. On this slide that's before you, the school capacity for elementary school, it's the school capacity listed in the most recent school master plan, the preferred scenario of the school committee, which is to renovate the Pollard for 6 through 8, to turn the High Rock into a 6th elementary school, and to renovate the Mitchell as a 3-section school. So that 2854 represents the elementary school capacity under that scenario.
When that's done.
When that's
So if these apartments are built on the likely build within the next 5 years, and those elementary schools aren't done until 15 years, which is pretty much the pace we're at now with the master plan. What's gonna happen in those 10 years between when the students arrive and then when those elementary schools, Mitchell and High Rock, come online as elementary schools?
Yeah, for the build outs, we have, RKG had given us build out projections for the full build out. It was 19 years and 34. Lee and I talked with Ann Gulati, and when we were working on the traffic study, also in figuring out what build outs did we think were appropriate for traffic and for future school needs. We did apply a 10-year build out for the base and the neighborhood for the likely scenarios. And in the school enrollment, we applied 4 years to the property at 100 West. That feels like the only property that is like tangibly before us as a development. So that brings us, the 10 years is 2034. The school master plan has the Pollard and High Rock completed in 2031 and the Mitchell in 2038. There's a long way to go, but just to put it into context, that they're, that's the timeframe that we're working with.
And then what's the total dollar amount for that school master plan that we're using for purposes of your capital, your capital analysis?
I don't have that built in, but I certainly can follow up on the total dollar amount. And I can speak to the analysis related to the current schools. Just make a note. So for school capacity, the middle school capacity figure, that 1,335 is the number that MSBA and the town have come to agreement for to build if the MSBA chooses ultimately to partner with the town. And the 1,800 for high school is the current capacity of the high school. And so the conclusion for comparing to school master plan scenario really is that the elementary school under the school committee's preferred master plan can accommodate both the base and the neighborhood plan. The projected enrollment for middle school would exceed the MSBA capacity at the Pollard by 34 students, which is 2.5% under the base plan, and 5.5% or 74 students under the neighborhood plan. And at the high school level, the neighborhood housing plan likely build exceeds by less than 1%, 7 seats out of 1,800. The chart that I just circulated adds into both scenarios current school capacity. And I think what I hope jumps out at folks is that the kind of pinch points for capacity actually switch from the middle school under the preferred master plan to the elementary school under our existing capacity. I think to me that kind of confirms the goals of the master plan to want to add elementary school capacity and changing the use of the High Rock from a 6th grade to elementary school. So under current enrollment or current school capacity, if the school master plan does not come to be, elementary in the base plan, it's 49 seats over, which is 2%, and 158 seats over under the neighborhood plan, which is 6%. So it's almost comparable. The shortfalls are shifting from the middle school to the elementary.
The MSBA capacity, I mean, under the plan, it doesn't necessarily translate to what we actually may propose, correct?
I would disagree with that. I think that the MSBA partnership comes with them getting to decide certain things, and they do weigh in on the maximum student enrollment that they're willing to fund and partner with you on. And
So
so
if we wanted to build something slightly bigger and take on the additional costs, or is it all or none? In other words, we get all whatever they're gonna give us only if we build to their plan, or because I thought we've done in other projects, we've gone above. I know like SUNY Williams has many more kids in it than the MSBA plan, original plan was.
yeah.
I know we repurposed rooms to do that, but
So I guess I'd give two answers. One is that I think the school district is constantly managing fluctuations in enrollment by school and figuring out how to be nimble with space. Because you build a concrete structure and then
Right.
kids do kind of ebb and flow. So SUNITA right now is, I think 27% more students currently there than MSBA allowed us to build the size of that school too. I do think that there are opportunities with MSBA, although this is not my area of expertise, where if you can prove kind of an educational value, you might be able to add something on that MSBA won't partner with you on, like a theater or an auditorium. I don't know that they would allow additional classrooms. I'll leave that to the
Okay, I'm
superintendent.
just curious.
Yeah.
But you could do, so it's set on PPBC for 4 years, I mean, for 10 years. One of the things that they would allow you to do is all the programming that they don't allow, that could be extra, and then you could repurpose, as you
Right.
were saying.
Which is what happened with Smith Williams.
Correct, so.
Okay.
Like pay for a pool, but put classrooms in it.
Right.
Something like that.
We'll name it the dog cuddly.
You do the amenities, you do the amenities as an extra, right?
Okay, going back to the school count, and I know you built off of, Charles River Landing and Kendrick Street and, Madera. Was there any analysis that sort of, those two, Kendrick Street and Charles River Street are really sort of way out there, they're far away from the schools, are not really considered to be sort of a building for children. And what the ratio of children there is compared to what it is at Madera, which I would say is more of a, to use your term, a neighborhood, apartment building. Near two schools, Mitchell and Broad Meadow, and how many students were yielded from that building as opposed to the other two, and saying maybe with these projected things being built even closer to schools and right in the middle of town, that they might be even more attractive to, families with children, whether they're putting them in, 1 bedroom, 2 bedrooms, or 3 bedrooms, and saying maybe we should count less of those two buildings over there and focus more and just use the Modera number.
Yeah, the reason we chose the 3 that we used is the school district had been using Kendrick and Modera to track each year because all of the other multifamily housing in town was already kind of in the background base of our student enrollment. And so when McKibben was doing projections, the Kendrick and Modera were the new ones that were coming in. And so they tracked every single year. What do we, from before it's built, what do we think the students are going to be? And then we're going to track it every year and see how those compared to the anticipated projections. And Charles River Landing was kind of the comparison point for the Kendrick and the Modera. So we use them in this because of that, because it had been kind of the projects that McKibben had been tracking over the last number of years. We have gotten requests to look at other multifamily housing that's kind of in the zoned area to pull those current student enrollments. I've been in touch with the school department, and so we'll pull additional data that we can, but that's kind of why these were chosen.
Cause even the, just anecdotally, it just seems like, is it the Charles River Court or the Charles Court Apartments? I drive by there every day in the morning, and there seems to be, every time I drive by, more and more families with children waiting at the bus stop to get on the bus. And that's an existing building.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can use even something like that.
Yeah.
To John's point, it's closer to schools. That's an area that will be built out more as part of the community, whereas the Kendrick was specifically designed to favor 1-bedroom units that wouldn't put pressure on the schools.
Yeah, the unit breakdown, I think, does matter quite a bit because the Kendrick has a pretty similar profile to the standard breakout that RKG is using, because they're of course looking across the whole zoned area. So they're not saying that every single project is going to have 10% studios, 45%, but looking at it in the aggregate, the unit distribution across these 3 projects does equal out pretty closely to RKG's assumptions kind of out of CoStar. So I think that gave us some level of comfort, but ultimately developers will decide, are they building 1 and 2 bedroom units? Are they building for families? Modera, I think, is built for families and marketed as such. And so some of that is, outside of our control, but we can pull more data.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Pivoting to Department of Public Works. So again, just to start kind of with the punchline, particularly for water and sewer, DPW does not anticipate the proposed zoning will result in new capital projects. And I just want to highlight these bullets as to really what underpins that conclusion. First is that these are areas that are already developed. We don't have a site that's kind of unattached to our water and sewer system like some other communities might have. These are fully built out for water and sewer. We're thinking about what does drive the need for capital infrastructure improvements, and it's the age and condition of the existing infrastructure most often. And so these are things that we're gonna have to deal with as a town, regardless of whether the zoning kind of comes in or not. As Lee mentioned, in the site plan review process, all developments must show adequate water, sewer, and utility service. The state's guidelines are explicit that the town does not need to shoulder any capital investments to make a project viable. One interesting thing that came up in a lot of our discussions was at some sites, new housing developments may actually reduce pressure on the overall system. I'm not saying this as a blanket that this is going to happen on every single site, but first, if depending on what the current use is and flipping it, for example, a restaurant or a medical use might use much more water than a multifamily housing use might. So depending on what that use switch is, you could actually see a reduction. And then I think what is more likely to impact this is the age of the existing building. So we now have much more stringent requirements for stormwater management. We have an opt-in energy code. We have infiltration and inflow requirements, which pulls stormwater out of our sewage system. These are things that were not in place when a lot of the existing buildings or some of the existing buildings were built. And so when redevelopment happens, they'll come up to this new standard and might actually relieve some of the pressure on our existing infrastructure. Two things to highlight in terms of water capacity. Needham is quite fortunate. We have two water sources, our local wells at Charles River and the MWRA. That gives us an ability to have capacity in terms of volume, but also redundancy. And so in our review of our infrastructure, Karis and her team had identified the pumping stations as kind of the pinch point in the system that might limit our capacity. That's 7 million gallons per day is the pumping capacity. The town's average use, and this has been incredibly consistent, at least over the last decade, is 3.7 million gallons per day. We have huge fluctuations in water usage depending on the season. Basically, when it's the summer, there's a lot of outdoor watering and the town's water usage spikes way up. So if you just look
What is the spike? What is the spike up to?
it can spike to when it gets over 6 million gallons per day. We start sending people notifications that ask them to be mindful of their usage. But in the winter months, the average use is between 2.3 and 2.6. So I think that number gives you a sense of people flushing their toilets and cleaning their dishes and taking showers as opposed to landscaping, which I think is important. And then from the sewer perspective, the largest capital need is to redo the 128 interceptor. This project's underway with ARPA funding and then annual town meeting appropriated funds just this past May. So I think was identified as what's the biggest infrastructure need in our system. That is the need. It's in the capital plan. It's being funded, and this zoning won't impact the scope or the cost of that project.
One question I had on the water, aside from the infrastructure, we have the two sources.
Yeah.
And I think the more we use the MWRA, the higher fee we have to pay for that. Was there any analysis done that says if we add this much housing, if water usage requires us to go to the MWRA more frequently, what financial impact that could have on the town, right? Because I think we've talked about that before, about the annual cost we have to pay to the MWRA, depending on usage.
Can I have Karis speak to that?
So the single largest variable we have for MWRA usage is the need for irrigation in the summer months. And you'll see wild swings in the type of irrigation that's required in each year. For example, last year, we had 2023, we had a much wetter summer. We had much less usage. We had a lower MWRA utilization. The year before that, we had a drought, in which case we had higher utilization. There's a few other factors that are in play as to what our summer water usage will look like, especially with the state trying to mandate water restrictions within the community. If we go into drought status again, they would probably limit our use of MWRA water if we were required to comply. What we really looked at when we looked at this particular zoning was what are the major drivers of our water usage? And because irrigation is a large component of that, and the way that these properties would be anticipated to be developed would limit landscaping compared to other potential uses, or what you would see for like single family development. There wasn't a concern that there'd be additional pressure in the summer months when we require MWRA usage, and the additional consumption that may be used in these facilities in the regular months would be within our capacity to generate water during the winter months at the Charles River Treatment Plant, where we don't supplement with MWRA water. The only time we would supplement is if for some reason we had some issues with any of our wells, but we also have in our capital plan funding for a redundant well, which would enable us to continue to generate the amount permitted from our Charles River Water Treatment Plant facility without having to go to the MWRA. So we have that in our capital plan as well. The other thing I just would also note is one of the concerns we have with water usage, why we send the notes out when we hit about 6 million gallons per day, is because when we have irrigation system, the irrigation season combined with like people waking up in the mornings, making coffee, taking showers, it puts an immense pressure on our system and drains the tanks that we have, the 2 tanks that supply the vast majority of water to the town at a rapid speed. With water usage that is more spread out throughout the day, non-irrigation, we don't have the same level of concerns about producing or providing water at that same time.
Thank you.
The next slide, we get into stormwater. I want to be clear, stormwater, both quality and quantity, is a top priority for the town. It is a concern. We do have flooding throughout town, including in some of the proposed areas for rezoning. And when we were talking about, tackling this from a systemic perspective and then site-specific development perspective, kind of the information I think that is most useful is DPW has funding both through ARPA and annual town meeting to do a townwide stormwater master plan. It's much more helpful to look at the town holistically and where one watershed feeds into the next, instead of just looking at kind of hyper localized areas. So that work is underway or will be starting soon. Just can clarify. And then when we think about specific developments and how we handle stormwater, the town does have a stormwater bylaw currently for properties where there's 4,000 square feet or more of impervious surface. Those properties do already have to require that there's no impact to abutters. 4,000 square foot of impervious surface is quite a bit. And so single family homes largely are not captured in this, and they have a much lower standard currently under our stormwater bylaw. The select board established a working group to look at this bylaw and recommend strengthening it and areas to strengthen it. So we're anticipating the recommendations from that working group in 2025. I think if anything, I anticipate that they'll be recommending that the requirements on future developments be more stringent than we have today. Next slide. Traffic. So
Actually, just stop you. So
sure.
do I understand correctly if I'm on capital that with respect to schools, water, sewer, and stormwater, which I think are the 4 categories that we've gone over so far, that sort of the conclusion is that this plan won't add anything so long as we do what we're planning to do in each of those categories. Is that a fair summary of
We
it?
do what we're planning. Yes.
So in other words, we don't have to do anything extra, but we're gonna have to do what we're planning to do in order to accommodate this potential units and housing.
I would caveat that a little bit and just say that, I think the department submitting these requests believe we have to do those plans based on current conditions, but that does ultimately say, yes, those plans would also support this future development.
And so for each of those plans, so I know you don't need it now, but can you please get us the number that's being used? In other words, what is the school master plan? Is it 500 million? Is it 600 million? Is it 200 million? What is the water and sewer capital that you're using as part of this analysis? Is it 400 million? Is it 600? I'd just like to know the numbers for each of the categories.
Yeah.
So
In-
what is that supports your analysis, that if we do what we think we need to do to maintain ourselves currently, what those dollars amounts are, so we know what it is that, in a sense, we have to do, and we probably really have to do if we're gonna add 10,000 residents to the town, or 5,000 residents to the town, or 2,000 residents to the town.
Yeah, the capital memo in your packet does outline the FY 25 to 29 capital projects that DPW has submitted for water, sewer, stormwater, so those figures are reflected, but I can put it kind of in one
Yeah,
place.
like, yeah, what.
And I
it'd be
need
good in
to-
one place
I need
say,
to add the
yeah,
schools.
that's fine, what
Yeah.
you guys are using when you, for this analysis that you're presenting to us, which is helpful, and thank you for doing it. But it'd be good to have what sort of cumulatively, what we're staring at, in those categories.
Katie, will that information also have what will you anticipate a possible MSBA?
I will ask the school department, I don't know, if they're to the point of attaching a dollar amount to the value of that partnership.
Yeah, I
or-
mean, if we get a grant from them, and it's $45 million. For an MSBA school, for one that, like Pollard, let's say, one that is in high need of. Because that's.
So every dollar helps, I mean, I'm just looking, let's say what the gross, and we can do the net, I mean, what the gross is amount, because some of these capital projects, we're gonna be getting grants or maybe some other things for water and sewer that might reduce
That can
somewhat the
offset some of
tip,
it,
but I think
right.
it's important to know what the gross amount is.
Correct. Yeah,
And so it would be good to have that for each of these, and the same thing to get into traffic, so I'll ask the same thing for there.
Right.
So John, I think you also mentioned stormwater. So Karis, this might be more of a question perhaps related to these. And the existing structures that are there have a requirement that is quite old, which is minimal requirement, I believe minimal requirement compared to what's required now as far as stormwater mitigation and so forth. And so the existing buildings, which is pretty much where the new buildings would be. So the new buildings, I think, would have a much more stringent requirement for stormwater captivation. Is that correct? Is that fair to
That's
say,
correct.
Karis?
Yes.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah, yeah. it's just-
No, I'm talking about the town,
Yeah.
I'm talking about the town,
Yeah.
what our stormwater plan is for our interceptors and that type of thing, and just so we know, what it is that we're saying, these are the things we're understand we have to do.
Great. Traffic. Thank you, the finance committee. You supported us with a reserve fund transfer. We hired GPI to conduct a traffic analysis. They used the Hone recommended zoning because that's what we had at the time in April. And we had them take the base and the neighborhood likely build outs over a 10-year timeframe. So I analyzed 15 key intersections from Chestnut Street, the junction, to Highland at Webster, and looked at current traffic condition data that we had. They did traffic counts to fill in where we had gaps. Then they projected out what the conditions would be in 2034 if we had no zoning, so a no build scenario, and then compared that to traffic anticipated under the base and the neighborhood likely build outs. There's a full memo and slide deck in your packets, but just for the punchlines, GPI recommended potential mitigation strategies for 9 of the 15 intersections. For the other 6, my brain's fried. For the other 6 intersections, they did not think that they needed mitigation under any of these scenarios. So 9 of the 9 intersections and the types of mitigation that they were suggesting were changing kind of how signals talk to each other, roadway restriping, pedestrian timings, and adding signals where maybe we don't have them today. When we took this analysis and met with DPW, engineering and highway, overlaid this with our existing capital plan, DPW already in the capital projects is working to address 7 of the 9 intersections. The 2 intersections that were recommended, but that are not in our current planning is, I believe, Chestnut at School Street and May at Webster. And with those mitigation measures, GPI's conclusion was that our roadway system could handle the build outs of both plants. If we go to the next slide, it will speak to the vice chair's comments earlier in the meeting about Chestnut Street. So those major roadway improvement projects that DPW is already working on is Great Plain Ave redesign from Linden to Warren, and Highland Avenue redesign from Webster Street, where the state project concluded, all the way down to Great Plain Ave. They are at a point in their process where they can take whatever happens at October town meeting and build projected growths into the designs of those projects. So that window has not closed yet. The 2 items that are not in our current capital plans and that may become a priority because of this zoning is a redesign of Chestnut Street. We did a kind of an order of magnitude estimate between $10 and $20 million. And then completion of the rail trail or an alternative network for bicycles. The rail trail we have looked at, I think, in kind of fits and starts over the years. It's not currently in our capital plan. We do have some estimates on connecting from the current rail trail to the junction and connecting from the Heights over the highway to Newton. This hasn't been a priority, but that may change if there's a lot of build out around Chestnut Street. So I think those really are the 2 areas where we thought the zoning could drive a capital need, as opposed to most of the other capital needs being driven by current conditions. There's one other thing I want to say on that, and it escaped me. Okay.
So just going back to GPI's conclusion.
Yeah.
So I was looking at your capital impacts assessment of proposed. And it was a great chart here about talking about the units and then the number of students and then number of residents, and you gave a range for the residents.
Yeah.
So if I'm just looking at neighborhood housing plan likely build, and the projected new residents that could bring or it is a range between 1,996, so I'll say 2,000 to 3,864, so I'm gonna say 4,000.
Yeah.
On the likely build of that. Am I correct that GPI is saying that under those new residents with the potential cars that those new residents would bring, that other than the current sort of mitigation matters we have, there's no other, all other roadways are gonna be the same, the traffic's gonna be the same, we're gonna have less queues in places around town. So do I understand that's their conclusion?
That is their conclusion. The factor that they used was the 1 parking spot per unit. In terms of how many cars we're gonna have. Yeah.
But that's a minimum. It doesn't mean that people they might have more than, a unit might have 2 or 3 cars,
Right,
correct?
right.
Okay, but
So
if you
they-
went just by residents and just say, a car per resident or half a car per, 3/4 of a car per resident, I'm sure if you took in the town of Needham, how many cars are registered in the town versus the number of 32,000 residents, that it's, you have that ratio. I'm talking out loud, but I'm just concerned that it doesn't seem like an acceptable thing to say the traffic's gonna be fine when you're adding that.
The analysis in terms of how they build out future growth, even the no build situation, is applying kind of an annual traffic growth rate of 1% per year compounded based on current. They added trip generation rates, mode share rates, who's gonna be walking, biking, transit. I can get you more specifics, but what I would say is in their presentation of the planning board, GPI said that they went very conservative on all of those, so they felt like their analysis was a worst case scenario. And just the data that they use are kind of these rates, not a direct correlation to population, kind of in just how they analyze traffic.
And like RKD, we haven't had this sort of a fact check on GPI or anything like that, is that?
No, I mean, engineering and highway staff have reviewed it and they reviewed kind of throughout in the discussions with GPI all along. But GPI is who we have used historically to fact check other transportation proposals. So I think we kind of relied on their expertise.
Thank you.
Yes. Parking, this was already brought up, so I'll just highlight again, minimum of one space. The MAPC perfect fit study showed that in this area, the actual demand was just under that. We did the Stantec study for the town in 2023. They looked at the zoning requirements under the planning board's existing bylaws and kind of noted that for each type of use, the planning board standard right now exceeds the best practices and national standards. And so that's something that the planning board will be looking at more broadly. And for environmental, all housing must comply with state and local environmental regulations. The opt-in specialized energy code, which the town passed last fall, is now in effect. And so anything built under this zoning, if it's over 12,000 square feet, would need to be passive house. And if it's under 12,000, it can have fossil fuel, or it can be all electric. But if it has fossil fuel, it has to be pre-wired for future electrification.
And passive house just in general is like you have to have triple pane windows, you have to have everything. You have somebody who comes in and looks at all your insulation so that there's no leakage, so it's really, really stringent.
Lydia, this gets to your question from probably an hour ago. Funds at risk.
Exactly 2 hours ago.
I know, we're getting there, we're so close. So I tried to frame this in buckets, to clarify kind of where the risk is coming in for these funds. So in the statute of the MBTA communities law, there are 4 funding sources explicitly listed that the legislature included in the law and said, if you're not compliant with this law, you won't be eligible for these 4 funding sources. I've highlighted just 2 because I think that they are the 2 that are relevant to Needham. MassWorks is a very nimble infrastructure grant program. It's discretionary from the state. You can do like water, sewer, roadway improvements. We did get a $1.7 million grant for First Avenue infrastructure project improvements. Housing Works was just added to the law recently, and it's basically a program that the state's using to mirror MassWorks, but tying those infrastructure improvements to housing development. MassWorks historically has been to spur economic development, usually commercial, and so they've created one specifically for Housing Works. I think how I worded this is misleading, so let me just clarify that Housing Works is not only for compliant communities, but they are definitely taking compliance into consideration for awarding those. Then the state agency EOHLC issued guidelines for the implementation of this law. In those guidelines, they listed out 13 additional discretionary grant programs that compliance would be taken into account. I didn't list them out. There is a full list in your packet. And I would say that these aren't grants that the town historically relies on, but we always want to be able to apply for as much as we can. Is how I'd summarize that bucket.
And EOHLC is the one that reviewed all of our documentation. They're the ones that gave us the feedback, so they know what we're complying.
Yeah. So this last bucket, I think, is where we have the greatest risk, and it's for 2 reasons. One, because it's a little bit hard for us to keep a comprehensive list of growing awarding authorities who are now considering this in their decisions. So it's a bit of a nebulous list to get our hands around, and it's big dollar items that the town really wants and could benefit from regardless of the zoning. So for example, Congressman Auchincloss, he includes in his federal budget process opportunities for communities in his district to get community project funding. In the past 4 years, he's secured $2 million for the Center Street Central Ave Bridge. That money's actually gone to Dover, but it benefits Needham. We'd have to share the cost of that project. And in process right now is a request for $1.1 million just for Needham for stormwater best management practices. That 3.1 million is not at risk. He's honoring anything that's been awarded or is in process, but his office has confirmed with us that moving forward, they will not support any requests from non-compliant communities. The NPO, the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization, is the group that makes determinations for how a bulk of federal and state transportation dollars go to support largely regional, but also local transportation projects. This is the funding source that we are trying to secure for the Highland Ave redesign. That project's at a $20 million value. And they have confirmed with our highway division that they are taking compliance into consideration. And then lastly is just this kind of growing list that we come across as grant opportunities get issued by state agencies. And so we don't really know until the award, not the award, the opportunity to apply information gets publicized, and then we go in and we see, oh, this year it is a factor in their consideration. So Green Communities Act is just one example of that. I don't have a comprehensive list. It's a bit of a moving target at this point.
I think Gabby has already applied to some grants under some things,
Yeah.
it's green communities per se, but certainly related to climate action.
Yes,
It's
and
already gotten,
Yeah.
just got one.
yeah,
So things like section 90 or, funds or,
those are not at risk right now. We did ask about chapter
And-
90.
How about MSBA?
I have not seen anything that links MSBA with this compliance.
the big ones, schools,
Well, the
what do they call it, the,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, for special, like, the.
chapter 90,
The-
no,
the
that's
circuit
erosion.
breaker.
Circuit breaker, thank you.
School thing.
No, chapter 70, UGA, circuit breaker, kind of the things that flow through the cherry sheet.
Yeah.
I've not heard any of that being tied to this. So nothing that kind of underpins our operating budget
Right.
as a core function. It's a lot of discretionary.
Okay.
I'd say the tip one to me.
So
Maybe,
two things on that. One is, for example, like, this is what Milton has put at risk by
Right.
taking the course of action they've taken, right? They basically say that they're gonna lose out these funds or potentially lose out these funds by virtue of them not complying with the act. So, and second, am I correct that we would put these at risk by not passing the base plan?
Correct.
They're not at risk if we don't pass the neighborhood plan, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so they're only at risk if we don't pass the base plan.
correct.
Which is why we did it, so that we could have a safe, almost similar to what we currently have to be able to pass it. And then for additional housing for this, but I have to say, I find it hard to believe that, I mean, the school, MSBA, MSBA is state. Money, so I find it hard to believe that they would. That they wouldn't say that you need to comply.
I have not seen anything that they are considering this, but we could certainly ask outright. They have a board and fall under the treasurer, not the governor, so I don't want to make any assumption.
No, I mean, you're being safe, but I'm just saying, I think it would be.
Yeah, we can ask.
bizarre if they didn't hold back for.
We can ask.
Compliance for.
So what's the timeline of compliance? I saw the December timeline is when you have to submit everything, right? And then this project is gonna be a 10 years of a project. At what point do you say, okay, you submit by December, you're considered compliant? Or like,
As long as,
That's
the-
it?
yes, the zoning's in place, we're compliant, it
Yeah.
doesn't require anything to be
to
built.
happen?
Right.
Oh,
We
I
can't
see.
take it away.
Got it,
We can change it as long as you don't reduce the numbers.
got it.
And you could also change over time the base. If we just pass the base, we could, a year from now,
Reset the stake in compliance.
yeah, so as long as we're compliant, we can add on to, we can see how something works, and if it's not working or something, you can add to it or change it or something like that.
We always
just
have,
because-
we always have that ability, we've always had that.
Well, I just want to make
As
sure
long
that,
as
that
you
as long as you stay
stay
compliant, you
compliant.
can always.
Stay compliant.
So if there's no developer ever interested in come developing these areas, we propose that's not our problem.
Correct.
Yeah,
I'm
we have other problems because then nobody.
That's a real problem. You give them a gift and they don't take it.
They're trying to encourage it, we can do it easily, but there's a big need from a lot of the town members that came to all the community meetings. There seems to be,
There's a need for that.
a need for additional housing.
Is there a limitation, say, how many people can stay in a unit? If you're a 2 bedroom, you put a limitation on the maximum.
Yeah, that's by code. You can't jam 20 people into a 2 bedroom. You can only do a certain amount per square foot.
Right.
So it's, I mean, the building code, it would be illegal.
Not that it doesn't happen.
But you'd get caught,
Exactly.
I'm here, you'd get caught. It's not the norm.
There's
There were actually the
There's
flight
lots of
attendants,
people
the
apart.
flight attendants that got caught, right, like in Winthrop or something like that, right? But
The handout that just went around really is the last thing. One of the questions Molly sent in advance was asking our sense of kind of where are communities overall, relative to this law, and our communities doing base compliance versus something expanded. So I just want to walk through this. This is from HLC's data. It's September 4th. There are town meetings happening all the time, so I would anticipate this is slightly dated, but it's the most accurate source as of September 4th. 71 communities have adopted. Only 3 have actually been approved by the state. 68 are in the queue to be reviewed. 106 have not yet adopted, and I'd say the majority, 74 are coming up with fall town meetings. They have a deadline of this calendar year. Another 31, which are smaller, kind of more rural adjacent communities, have a deadline of next year. And only 2 communities are not compliant, Milton and Holden. Milton attempted, as you know, and they're in the lawsuit. Holden never advanced any proposals and has just opted out.
is that an option?
No, yeah, yes, JC. Stay tuned. But so the second question was much harder to answer, but I wanted to share what I felt comfortable providing, which is, are people passing compliance versus expanded? I've only provided the 3 communities that have gotten official final approval letters from the state, because it's very hard to dig into each community and see what they passed and did they have any amendments on town floor and all of that. So certainly not representative, but of the 3 that we have final conclusive data, Salem submitted 62% unit capacity beyond the minimum required. That got edited down in the HLC review process to only 12% greater. Arlington submitted 64% greater. That got edited down to 52%. And Lexington, I think, is quite an anomaly. They went 11 times greater than required, and their final determination is 10 times. So
what causes the state to reduce it?
I think it's all the technicalities of the requirements and contiguity and, percent around transit and kind of all the technical requirements.
Yeah, I don't think the state's trying to reduce it. They're just saying what the town submitted isn't factually correct. So what actually.
Yes.
So it's a
Yes, thank
consequence
you.
of
Yeah,
what,
it's a consequence.
of their application.
Yeah, I'd say that's.
Yes,
fantastic.
that's
That's
a
why
better
we
way of
gave
framing
ourselves
it.
a little bit of leeway on the base plan
Yes,
in case.
some cushion.
Yeah.
Hey, we talked about, I feel like a lot of the conversation tonight has been sort of the cost. Have there been conversations about benefit? I mean, bringing people into a community, also you're boosting a local economy, Needham has a split tax rate.
Yeah.
We could take advantage of that to support projects in town. Has any analysis been done on that?
Yes and no. So on the 9th, you'll hear from Eric on the fiscal impact. That's really, do we think that the tax revenue generated by these units would support the costs needed for municipal services to support the units? We haven't done an analysis of overall economic benefits. What's the benefit of construction jobs? What's the benefit of more people being in the economy and going to local businesses? We have not done those analyses. I think, we can pull the conclusions of analyses that have been done for children's, for, TripAdvisor. I think we all know new growth is good and necessary to support the town's goals. So the analysis from RKG is not that holistic, impact on the overall economy. It's very much looking at the operating budget for the town. But I would welcome the discussion about the value of more people living and working here.
I just think it would be a.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We need that to have a.
Yep.
A balanced conversation.
And I will say, throughout the whole process, we heard quite regularly from the business community. We heard from small business owners, we heard from big employers in town. They all were supportive of additional housing and kind of really tying it to their viability as a business. They're having a lot of harder time finding workers who are traveling much longer distances. This is something we've experienced as the town as an employer. So it's definitely relevant, and I think does get lost in the analyses. So thanks for
Hopefully,
raising it.
there's a lot of housing right near the shops. That's what this housing is, it's near the shops.
And it's not only just the private, it's also the public. I mean, school, getting teachers to come here that can't live here, right? So it's also for some of our public jobs.
Okay, thank you. Great information. We really appreciate it. Thank you for that.
Hopefully it doesn't take 2.5 hours to present it on meeting.
Taking notes on your editing advice.
So next week you'll have the slides that are being updated on the fiscal impact analysis, right? Or we can get them ahead of time.
Yes, yep, yes,
We
we're
blew your agenda.
meeting, we're meeting tomorrow. We're meeting tomorrow.
Can we do funds at risk at the first? And if you don't do this, here's the impact. Thank you.
So I'm gonna tell you and Meg tomorrow. Okay. Everyone.
Yes.
Article 13, Town Hall repairs. We're seeking, an appropriation of $100,000. And the purpose of that is to fund, pay for costs to hire engineering and design services related to the Town Hall project. The HVAC system in Town Hall is very problematic. We've had, several failures. And our backup generator system is not really designed to keep the building running beyond life and safety operations, and we need to upgrade the systems. We've had several equipment failures as a result of the loss of the air conditioning. And most recently it interrupted services just last week. And that's the reason why we're moving forward, seeking funding now for the design and engineering, so hopefully we'll be able to come back for construction funding in the spring.
Was the replacement of this in the capital plan anytime soon?
This was unexpected.
So replacing or the DH, it wasn't in the capital plan. Ultimately, it's gonna,
Correct, it was not in the capital plan. The system is now 13 years old. You think, and you think that normally we look for 15 to 20 years, so it was in the most recent plan, it wasn't there. But the failures have started about a year and a half ago, but it hasn't ended, and the repairs of the system are costly because the equipment is not supported. Parts, some of the parts are not manufactured anymore.
So what would ultimately, is there an estimate for the total cost?
Well, if I use rule of thumb, usually design engineering is 10% of the cost. I would suggest it could be $1 million total cost. But the fast track on this, the 100,000 is conservative. So it's perhaps we won't need all that money, which would suggest also the total cost should be less. But until they come in and look at different systems, because we actually have two systems. There's one that pulls a particular area of the building. And then there's the larger system that pulls and moves air from the rest of the building. If it's determined, the whole system is not problematic, just the specialized area, then the cost should be significantly less. The generator, of course, is the entire system, so that's regardless of the size of the scope, that cost is probably consistent.
Questions? Anyone? Discussion?
I make a motion that the finance committee recommend adoption of Article 13, to appropriate $100,000 for the engineering design of the town hall HVAC repairs, to be spent or transfer from the overlay surplus.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Thank you. Article 14.
Madam Chair, this is, and as we've discussed at previous meetings, this is the first step in shoring up the different stabilization funds. In this effectively is going to change the purpose, basically make it clearer the purpose of the capital improvement fund. It's going to be renamed the capital equipment fund. The focus will be having funds set aside or if they're needed at a time that equipment needs to be replaced, but there's insufficient funding sources at the time for a planned replacement. They can't cover the items that we would envision as if a fire engine, for instance, needs to be replaced. The delay of that by a year or two, given that's usually a 2-year window from when we get the money appropriated to when the truck is built, and if we were in a year that we didn't have. That would be an example where this could be a funding source that town meeting could rely upon. The second part of what this would do is it would earmark monies received from the sale of surplus equipment to go be credited directly into the fund, and they'd be filled up over time. This is a fund that in our conversations, basing on the cost of 2 expensive vehicles, basically fire engines, would be $3 million. Would be the target that we want this bill to fund up to. And currently there's 1.7 million in the fund.
Can this fund the town hall HVAC system replacement?
No, even as it is before the change, because it's limited to the facility improvements of 250,000 or less, and we're in the capital plan. However, we do have the capital facility fund, which could, if we did not have funds, fund something like that type of an improvement.
So Dave, just a question about the actual, in the warrant, or at least a draft warrant I had, it says appropriate to capital improvement fund, and then, but the motion itself is basically just changing the name of the fund.
And earmarking the revenues, the finalized.
So will we actually, with this article, we actually transferring the money as well into the new fund, or how?
It's the actual title will now read amend stabilization fund.
Okay.
And I'll read the language, which is gonna appear in the warrant that's getting published, sent out for publication tomorrow. To see if the town will vote to amend the special stabilization fund adopted under Article 58 of the 2004 annual town meeting, called the Capital Improvement Fund, to now be known as the Capital Equipment Fund, to reserve funds for future appropriation, capital equipment, and in accordance with the 4th paragraph of MGL Chapter 40, Section 5B, which allows the dedication without further appropriation of 100% of the sale of surplus equipment collected into the fund for capital equipment purchases effective for fiscal 2026, beginning July 1st, 2025, or take any other action. That's what will be before town meeting.
Okay, great.
Any other questions, comments?
I would make a motion, the finance committee recommend adoption of Article 14. Now renamed, amend special stabilization fund.
Second.
All in favor?
Hi.
Madam Chair, it might be appropriate for the committee to take a vote that in the article that you have not yet taken a position, that it will be appearing in the warrant that's gonna go for publication or recommendation at town meeting.
Okay, because we haven't seen what, yeah.
That's like
Wait.
the article you just.
Yeah.
Right,
So that'll be Articles 9 through 11.
and Article 3, I believe,
The opioid one.
and the yes, correct, so
Mhm.
the opioid, payment settlement program.
Stephen Palmer.
Stephen Palmer, and then for, article related to zoning.
The motion I will make is that, finance committee will, make recommendation
That the warrant will show, recommendation
to be made at town meeting for all articles that we haven't so acted on in the special town meeting warrant.
Second.
All in favor?
I don't remember ever actually having that formally vote on that.
Usually we ask in the committee every, how many votes?
Some certainty.
But the committee goes back and forth, but
Yeah,
always
fine.
in concurrence that that's, they want to show next, and it's to make
Yeah.
a recommendation. Well, you say recommendation deferred, so. Of that, we would definitely want to vote. We've gotten more transparent. And, Madam Chair, reserve fund transfer, this is the reserve fund transfer, which was the subject matter the last meeting, seeking to transfer $90,600 into the finance department budget. This is to cover a cost associated with the recertification process that town's going through based upon contracts that we've entered into with, both a personal property company and, a company that's assisting with commercial and residential, real estate values.
Thank you for doing that, Dave. I think that's the right way to do it.
I've changed my mind. I think it should be a line item.
So do you have that, Carol? That,
I do have that,
so we need to vote on that.
yes.
I will make a motion that the finance committee, approve the reserve fund transfer of $90,000, from the reserve fund to the finance, department. Budget for the purposes described by Dave with respect to the assessment services that are, need to be provided.
Could you make that $90,600?
That's even better. 90,000 for the transfer, and then $600 for Dave's trip this weekend. $90,600.
Second.
All in favor? Great.
Madam Chair, that will come to you via DocuSign.
Wow. Wow.
Wow. Well, this isn't the first DocuSign that I've done.
Oh.
No, any other issues? We are meeting next Wednesday night. Thank you for
I'll
the
move to adjourn.
flexibility.
Next Wednesday will be.
Right, a week from
Nine.
now.
Right,
The ninth.
So the ninth.
right,
Okay.
the ninth. Sorry,
And then depending on the outcome of that, we'll be on the 16th or not.
right. Which we're doing?
Try twice.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great, thank you very much. This was a long meeting and I appreciate your patience. And welcome to Lydia. Thank you.
Hopefully you'll come back.
This is how we do it now.